The Rise and Fall of Ancient Israel and Judah. A Journey Through Time. Imagine living in a small village perched on a hilltop, surrounded by powerful empires that could crush your community at any moment. This was the reality for the people of ancient Israel and Judah. How did these small kingdoms not only survive but create a legacy that continues to shape our world today? The story of ancient Israel and Judah spans roughly 1,000 years, from the emergence of the Israelites in Canaan's highlands around 1200 BCE to the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. This isn't just ancient history, it's a narrative that has profoundly influenced three major world religions, countless works of art and literature, and continues to shape geopolitics today. What makes this history particularly fascinating is that we can piece it together from multiple sources: archaeological discoveries, ancient inscriptions, and biblical texts. Together, these sources tell a story of resilience, cultural innovation, and the birth of revolutionary religious ideas that would eventually transform the world. Let's begin with a mystery. Who were the first Israelites, and where did they come from? For many years, people assumed the biblical account was straightforward history. The Israelites escaped from Egypt, wandered in the desert, and conquered Canaan in a military campaign. But archaeological evidence tells a different and more complex story. Around 1200 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean experienced what scholars call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Major empires and city-states that had dominated the region for centuries suddenly crumbled. Egypt weakened, the Hittite Empire collapsed, and Canaanite city-states fell into decline. This created a power vacuum in the highlands of Canaan, the hill country that runs through what is today central Israel and the West Bank. In this highland region, archaeologists have discovered something remarkable. Between 1200 to 1000 BCE, hundreds of small villages suddenly appeared in areas that had been sparsely populated before. These weren't impressive cities with grand palaces. They were modest settlements with simple houses built around central courtyards. The people lived by farming and herding, growing crops on terraced hillsides and raising sheep and goats. The earliest mention of Israel comes from an Egyptian inscription called the Merneptah Stele, dated to around 1208 BCE. It's a victory monument where Pharaoh Merneptah boasts about his military campaigns in Canaan, claiming Israel is laid waste and his seed is no more. This tells us two things. First, that a group called Israel existed by this time, and second, that the Egyptian pharaoh considered them significant enough to mention. But here's where it gets interesting. When archaeologists examined these highland villages, they found no evidence of a foreign invasion or migration. The pottery, architecture, and tools showed clear continuity with Canaanite culture. However, there were some distinctive features. These villagers rarely ate pork, unlike their Philistine neighbors. Their houses had a distinctive four-room layout, and they used storage jars with a unique collared rim design. So who were these people? The evidence suggests they were mostly Canaanites who had moved from the lowlands to the highlands, possibly joined by nomadic pastoralists, and perhaps some escaped slaves or refugees from other areas. Over time, these diverse groups developed a distinct identity as Israelites. Think about it like this. These early Israelites weren't foreign invaders. They were locals who created something new. It's similar to how Americans didn't arrive from another planet. They developed a new identity from diverse origins. These early Israelite villages were remarkably egalitarian compared to the hierarchical Canaanite city-states. They had few signs of extreme wealth or poverty, suggesting a society where most people lived at roughly the same economic level. This social structure may have influenced early Israelite religious and ethical ideas about justice and fairness. According to the biblical narrative, around 1000 BCE, the Israelite tribes united under a monarchy, first led by King Saul, then by David, who captured Jerusalem and made it his capital, and finally by Solomon, who built the first temple. This united monarchy has been one of the most debated topics in biblical archaeology. The archaeological evidence for a grand, powerful kingdom in the 10th century BCE is limited. Jerusalem at this time appears to have been a relatively small settlement, not the imperial capital described in the Bible. Some scholars argue that the biblical accounts of David and Solomon reflect later traditions that magnified the achievements of these kings. However, recent excavations have uncovered impressive structures at sites like Khirbet Qeiyafa that date to this period. suggesting there was indeed some form of centralized authority. The debate continues, but most archaeologists now believe there was some kind of Israelite kingdom centered around Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE, though probably smaller and less powerful than the biblical descriptions suggest. What's not in doubt is the cultural importance of this period. The idea of Jerusalem as a sacred city, the legacy of David as the ideal king, and the temple as the center of worship became foundational concepts that would shape Israelite identity for centuries to come. According to both biblical and archaeological evidence, this kingdom split after Solomon's death around 930 BCE. The northern tribes formed the Kingdom of Israel with its capital eventually at Samaria, while the southern tribes formed the Kingdom of Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. These two kingdoms would develop along separate but related paths for the next 2 centuries. The Kingdom of Israel in the north quickly became the more powerful of the two. It had better agricultural land, controlled important trade routes, and had a larger population. Archaeological excavations at sites like Samaria, Megiddo, and Hazor reveal impressive building projects, palaces, fortifications, and water systems that demonstrate considerable wealth and engineering skill. Israel appears in Assyrian records by the mid-9th century BCE. The Kirk monolith mentions Ahab the Israelite contributing 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers to a coalition against Assyria at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. This suggests Israel was a significant regional power. The Kingdom of Judah in the south was smaller and poorer, centered around Jerusalem. For much of its history, it existed in the shadow of its northern neighbor. However, Judah had one crucial advantage: stability. While Israel experienced numerous violent coups and dynastic changes, Judah was ruled continuously by descendants of David. Both kingdoms faced constant threats from powerful neighbors. Israel contended with Damascus to the north and the Neo-Assyrian Empire beyond that. Judah faced pressure from Philistia to the west and Edom to the south. The Mesha Stele, a 9th century BCE inscription from Moab, in modern Jordan, describes how King Mesha rebelled against Israelite domination, providing a non-biblical perspective on regional politics. The turning point came in the late 8th century BCE. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, the superpower of its day, had been expanding westward. In 722 BCE, after a 3-year siege, the Assyrians captured Samaria and destroyed the Kingdom of Israel. According to Assyrian records, they deported over 27,000 Israelites and resettled people from other conquered territories in their place. These northern tribes became known as the 10 Lost Tribes because they largely disappeared from history. Judah survived as an Assyrian vassal state. Under King Hezekiah, c. 715, 686 BCE, Jerusalem underwent significant expansion and fortification. Hezekiah built the famous Siloam Tunnel, an underground aqueduct nearly 1,750 feet long that brought water from the Gihon Spring outside the city walls into Jerusalem, an engineering marvel that visitors can still walk through today. The tunnel's construction is commemorated in the Siloam inscription, which describes how 2 teams of workers started from opposite ends and met in the middle. Judah experienced a brief period of independence after Assyria's power declined, but soon faced a new threat: the Neo-Babylonian Empire. After several rebellions against Babylonian rule, Jerusalem was besieged and captured in 586 BCE. The Babylonians destroyed the city and Solomon's temple and exiled many of Judah's elite to Babylon. This catastrophic event, known as the Babylonian exile, marked the end of the independent kingdom of Judah. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of ancient Israel and Judah is their religious development. The archaeological record shows that early Israelite religion was not the strict monotheism we associate with later Judaism. Figurines of female deities found in Israelite homes suggest worship of goddesses alongside Yahweh. Inscriptions from Kuntilat Adrud mention Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting Yahweh may have had a divine consort. Over time, however, a movement toward exclusive worship of Yahweh gained strength, particularly among certain prophets and priests. King Hezekiah and later King Josiah of Judah implemented religious reforms aimed at centralizing worship in Jerusalem and eliminating foreign religious practices. The Babylonia and exile proved to be a crucial turning point. With the temple destroyed and the people displaced, religious leaders had to reimagine how to maintain their identity and practices. This crisis period saw the development of key concepts that would define Judaism: strict monotheism, emphasis on written scripture, and religious practices like Sabbath observance that could be maintained without a temple. When some exiles returned to Jerusalem under Persian rule and rebuilt the temple around 516 BCE, they brought these transformed religious ideas with them. This marked the beginning of Second Temple Judaism, which would eventually give rise to both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. The story of ancient Israel and Judah is one of remarkable resilience and adaptation. These small kingdoms, squeezed between powerful empires, managed not only to survive for centuries, but to create cultural and religious innovations that would transform the world. From humble beginnings in highland villages to the sophisticated urban cultures of the Iron Age kingdoms, from polytheistic roots to revolutionary monotheism, the people of ancient Israel and Judah repeatedly demonstrated an ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their core identity. What can we learn from their experience? Perhaps it's that cultural survival doesn't always depend on military might or political power. Sometimes it's the power of ideas and the ability to adapt that ensures a legacy. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah fell more than 2,500 years ago, but their cultural and religious innovations continue to shape our world today. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, the resilience and adaptability of these ancient peoples might offer inspiration. Their story reminds us that even small nations can have an outsized impact on history through the power of their ideas and the strength of their cultural identity. The Second Temple period marks a crucial transition in the history of ancient Israel, beginning with the return from Babylonian exile in 538 BCE and continuing until the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE. This era saw dramatic political, religious, and cultural developments that would permanently shape Jewish identity. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 538 BCE, he issued a remarkable proclamation granting religious freedom to peoples subjugated by the Babylonians. This decree, recorded on the famous Cyrus Cylinder, allowed Jewish exiles to return to their homeland. According to biblical accounts, approximately 50,000 Judeans led by Zerubbabel made the journey back to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, completing it around 515 BCE. A second wave of returnees, about 5,000 people led by Ezra and Nehemiah, arrived in 456 BCE with a mission to restore Jerusalem's walls and enforce religious practices. The land remained a Persian province called Yehud for the next 2 centuries. During this period, scholars believe the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, reached its final form through the editing and unification of earlier texts. The returning exiles adopted the Aramaic script they had used in Babylon, which evolved into the modern Hebrew alphabet we recognize today. They also brought back the Babylonian calendar, which heavily influenced the Hebrew calendar still used in Jewish communities. Life in Persian-era Judea was not without tensions. The Bible describes conflicts between the returning exiles and those who had remained in the land. The returnees, backed by Persian authority, likely became large landholders, creating economic disparities. Judea functioned essentially as a theocracy, governed by hereditary high priests alongside Persian-appointed governors who ensured order and tax collection. The Persian period ended when Alexander the Great swept through the region in 332 BCE, defeating the Persian Empire. After Alexander's death, his generals divided his conquests, and Judea became a contested frontier between the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Syria. After a century under Ptolemaic rule, the Seleucids conquered Judea in 200 BCE. Initially, Hellenistic rulers respected Jewish culture and protected Jewish institutions. Judea continued to be governed by the high priest as a Hellenistic vassal state. However, the region underwent increasing Hellenization, the adoption of Greek language, customs, and ideas, which created tensions between traditionalist Jews and those embracing Greek culture. These tensions exploded into open conflict when Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes desecrated the temple, banned Jewish religious practices, and forcibly imposed Hellenistic customs on the Jewish population in 167 BCE. This provoked the Maccabean revolt, led by the priest Mattathias and his sons. His son Judas Maccabeus recaptured Jerusalem in 164 BCE and purified the temple, an event still celebrated in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Following Judas's death, his brothers Jonathan and Simon skillfully navigated the political landscape, establishing the Hasmonean dynasty as Judea's rulers. They capitalized on the Seleucid Empire's decline and forged strategic alliances with the rising Roman Republic. Under John Hyrcanus, the Hasmoneans achieved independence and doubled Judea's territory, conquering Idumea, where they converted the Edomites to Judaism, Samaria, and parts of the coastal plain. His sons Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus declared themselves kings, further expanding Hasmonean territories to include Galilee and portions of Transjordan. The Hasmonean period saw the emergence of major Jewish religious movements that would shape Judaism for centuries. The Pharisees, who emphasized oral tradition and whose approach would eventually evolve into Rabbinic Judaism. The Sadducees, who were often from aristocratic families and recognized only the written Torah. And the Essenes, a mystical group who lived in desert communities and produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Pharisee sage Simeon ben Shettach established the first schools centered around meeting houses, laying groundwork for the synagogue-based Judaism that would emerge after the temple's destruction. The Hasmonean kingdom's independence ended when a succession dispute between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II led both sides to request Roman intervention. In 64 BCE, the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem and made Judea a Roman client kingdom with Hyrcanus II as high priest. Later, Caesar appointed Antipater, an Edomite convert to Judaism, as his representative in Judea after Jewish troops helped save his life in Alexandria. From 37 BCE to 6 CE, Antipater's son Herod the Great ruled as a Roman client king. Despite being known for his cruelty and paranoia, Herod was a masterful builder who dramatically expanded the temple in Jerusalem, making it one of the ancient world's architectural wonders. During this period, Jewish communities flourished throughout the Roman Empire, comprising as much as 10% of its total population. After Herod's death and a brief reign by his son Archelaus, Emperor Augustus made Judea a direct Roman province in 6 CE, governed by Roman prefects or procurators. This period saw growing tensions between the Jewish population and Roman authorities, centered on taxation, Roman religious practices, and attempts to place imperial images in the temple. These tensions were exacerbated by widespread messianic expectations and the emergence of various Jewish resistance movements. In 66 CE, these tensions erupted into the First Jewish-Roman War. After initial Jewish successes, the Romans under Vespasian and his son Titus besieged Jerusalem. In 70 CE, they captured the city and destroyed the temple, a catastrophic event in Jewish history that ended the sacrificial system at the heart of biblical Judaism. The war concluded with the fall of Masada in 73 CE, where Jewish rebels committed mass suicide rather than surrender to Roman forces. Jewish resistance flared again during the Diaspora Revolt, 115-117 CE, and most significantly in the Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132-136 CE. The latter was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whom some Jews considered the Messiah. After initial successes, this rebellion was brutally crushed by Emperor Hadrian. The consequences were severe. Jerusalem was rebuilt as the Roman colony Aelia Capitolina. Jews were banned from entering the city except on one day each year, and the province was renamed Syria Palestina in an attempt to erase its Jewish connection. The Jewish-Roman Wars transformed the Jewish people from a major population in the eastern Mediterranean into a dispersed minority. Many Jews were killed, sold into slavery, or fled to other regions. The demographic and cultural center of Jewish life shifted to Galilee and eventually to Babylonia, with communities spreading throughout the Mediterranean, Middle East, and beyond. Perhaps the most profound consequence of these events was the transformation of Judaism itself. With the temple destroyed, Jewish religious practice shifted from a sacrificial cult centered on the temple to a religion focused on prayer, Torah study, and communal gatherings in synagogues. Religious authority moved from priests to rabbis, scholars who interpreted Jewish law and tradition. This pivotal shift laid the foundation for Rabbinic Judaism, which would become the dominant form of Judaism through late antiquity and beyond, especially after the codification of the Babylonian Talmud. The Second Temple period thus represents a crucial transition in Jewish history, from a religion centered on a single sacred site to one that could be practiced anywhere, from a nation concentrated in a specific territory to a people who maintained their identity across vast distances, from a culture dependent on temple ritual to one sustained by text, interpretation, and communal practice. These adaptations ensured Judaism's survival despite the loss of political sovereignty and would profoundly influence the development of both Christianity and Islam in subsequent centuries. The late Roman period, 136–390 CE, marked a significant transition for the Jewish population in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The devastating defeat led to a dramatic demographic shift as Jewish presence in Judea significantly diminished. Many Jews relocated to diaspora communities, particularly to the flourishing Jewish centers in Babylonia and Arabia. Those who remained in the land of Israel shifted their center of life from the depopulated Judea to Galilee, with continued Jewish presence also in the southern Hebron Hills, Ein Gedi, and along the coastal plain. This period saw the countryside of Judea increasingly populated by pagans, including migrants from neighboring provinces like Syria, Phoenicia, and Arabia. Meanwhile, Jerusalem, renamed Aelia Capitolina, and other administrative centers were inhabited primarily by Roman veterans and settlers from western parts of the empire. Jews remained banned from living in Jerusalem except for one day a year when they were permitted to mourn the temple's destruction. Despite these challenges, Jewish intellectual and religious life continued to flourish, particularly in Galilee. The Romans permitted a hereditary rabbinical patriarch from the house of Hillel, known as the Nasi, to represent Jewish interests to Roman authorities. One of the most prominent Nasis was Judah ha-Nasi, who compiled the final version of the Mishnah around 200 CE, a monumental collection of Jewish oral traditions that would become foundational to Rabbinic Judaism. The Mishnah and later the Jerusalem Talmud were compiled during the 2nd to 4th centuries in Tiberias and Jerusalem, representing massive compendiums of rabbinical discussions and legal rulings. Jewish seminaries in Shepharim, Bet Sherem, and other Galilean towns continued to produce scholars who served on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court that relocated first to Sepphoris and later to Tiberias. Archaeological excavations have uncovered numerous synagogues from this period throughout Galilee, as well as the burial site of Sanhedrin leaders at Beit Shearim, demonstrating the vitality of Jewish communal life despite political subjugation. The 3rd century brought economic crisis to the Roman Empire, resulting in heavy taxation to fund imperial succession wars. This prompted additional Jewish migration from Syria-Palestina to the more tolerant Sasanian Empire, where a flourishing Jewish community with important Talmudic academies developed in Babylonia, engaging in scholarly rivalry with the academies in Palestine. A pivotal shift occurred in the early 4th century when Emperor Constantine made Christianity an accepted religion throughout the Roman Empire. His mother Helena's pilgrimage to Jerusalem, 326–328 CE, led to the construction of major churches at sites associated with Jesus' life, including the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The name Jerusalem was restored to the city, replacing Aelia Capitolina, as it transformed into a Christian center. While Jews were still banned from living in Jerusalem, they were permitted to visit and worship at the site of the ruined temple once a year. The subsequent century saw Christians working to eradicate paganism throughout the empire, destroying temples and suppressing classical Roman traditions. In 351–352 CE, another Jewish revolt erupted in Galilee against a corrupt Roman governor, showing that despite diminished numbers, Jewish resistance to Roman rule had not entirely disappeared. The Byzantine period, 390–634 CE, began when the Roman Empire split and the region became part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Under Byzantine rule, Christianity became the dominant religion in the region. The presence of holy sites attracted Christian pilgrims, many of whom settled permanently, contributing to the growth of a Christian majority. Byzantine authorities encouraged pilgrimage and appropriated lands to construct magnificent churches at locations connected to biblical narratives. Monasteries established near pagan settlements facilitated the conversion of local populations. During this period, the Jewish presence continued to decline, with Jews likely losing their majority status in Palestine during the 4th century. While Judaism remained the only non-Christian religion officially tolerated, restrictions on Jewish life steadily increased. Jews were prohibited from constructing new synagogues, holding public office, or owning Christian slaves. In 425 CE, following the death of the last Nasi, Gamaliel VI, the offices of Nasi and Sanhedrin were officially abolished, weakening the standing of Jewish academies in Palestine. This leadership void was gradually filled by the Jewish center in Babylonia, which would assume primacy in the Jewish world for generations to come. The 5th and 6th centuries witnessed a series of Samaritan revolts against Byzantine rule. Their suppression resulted in a significant decline of the Samaritan population and further consolidated Christian dominance in the region. While some Jews and Samaritans converted to Christianity during the Byzantine period, historical records primarily document individual conversions rather than mass community transitions. A dramatic shift occurred in 611 CE when Khosrow II, ruler of Sassanid Persia, invaded the Byzantine Empire with the help of Jewish fighters recruited by Benjamin of Tiberias. The Persians captured Jerusalem in 614 CE, taking the true cross, believed to be the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified, as a trophy. Nehemiah ben Hushiel was appointed governor of Jerusalem. Christian historians claimed Jews massacred Christians in the city, but archaeological evidence doesn't show widespread destruction, leading modern historians to question these accounts. This Persian-Jewish alliance proved short-lived. In 628 CE, Kavad II, Khosrow's son, returned Palestine and the true cross to the Byzantines and signed a peace treaty. Following the Byzantine reconquest, Emperor Heraclius massacred the Jewish population of Galilee and Jerusalem and renewed the ban on Jews entering the Holy City. The Byzantine period ended with the Muslim conquest of the Levant in the 630s, which would usher in a new era for the region and its Jewish population. The Islamic conquest brought significant changes to the political, religious, and social landscape of Palestine, ending centuries of Christian Byzantine rule and establishing new dynamics that would shape the region's history for the next several centuries. Throughout these tumultuous periods, late Roman and Byzantine Jewish communities demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Despite persecution, displacement, and diminishing numbers, they maintained their religious traditions, produced monumental works of scholarship like the Mishnah and Jerusalem Talmud, and preserved their distinct identity. The intellectual foundations laid during this period, particularly the transition from temple-based worship to rabbinic Judaism centered on prayer, study, and communal life, ensured Judaism's survival despite the loss of political sovereignty and would continue to evolve in the centuries ahead under Islamic rule. Early Muslim period, the transformation of Palestine. Imagine standing in Jerusalem in the year 635 CE. For centuries, this city had been under Byzantine Christian rule, with Jews banned from living within its walls. But now, an Arab army under the command of Umar ibn al-Khattab has arrived, bringing dramatic changes that would reshape the religious and political landscape of the entire region. The Muslim conquest of the Levant in the 630s marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Palestine. Unlike many military conquests of the era, the initial Arab takeover was relatively peaceful, with limited destruction of infrastructure or population loss. The region became part of Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, within the Rashidun Caliphate, the first Islamic state established after Muhammad's death. The new Muslim rulers divided Palestine into two military districts, Yund Filistan in the south, with its capital at the newly built city of Ramla, and Yund al-Urdun in the north, with Tiberias as its capital. One of the most significant immediate changes was the lifting of the Byzantine ban on Jews living in Jerusalem, allowing Jewish communities to return to their holy city after centuries of exclusion. In 661, a pivotal moment occurred when Muawiyah I was crowned caliph in Jerusalem, establishing the Umayyad dynasty that would rule from Damascus for nearly a century. The Umayyads left an indelible mark on Jerusalem's landscape. In 691, Caliph Abd al-Malik constructed the magnificent dome of the rock shrine on the Temple Mount. the very site where the Jewish temples had once stood. This golden-domed structure, which still dominates Jerusalem's skyline today, was not merely an architectural achievement, but a powerful statement of Islamic presence in the Holy City. A second monumental building, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was erected nearby in 705, further transforming the sacred space. The early Islamic period operated under a system that classified subjects based on religion. Jews and Christians, as people of the book, al-Kitab, received the protected status of dhimmis. This arrangement allowed them to practice their religions but required payment of a special tax called jizya and acceptance of certain social restrictions. While this system created a clear hierarchy with Muslims at the top, it generally provided more religious tolerance than had existed under Byzantine rule, particularly for Jews. In 750, internal tensions within the Islamic world led to the Abbasid Revolution, which overthrew the Umayyads. The new Abbasid caliphs shifted the imperial capital from Damascus to Baghdad, distancing the center of power from Palestine. This period, often called the Islamic Golden Age, saw the Arab Empire become the largest in the world, with Baghdad emerging as a global center of learning, science, and culture. During the Abbasid period, both Arabs and religious minorities often prospered across the region, contributing to significant scientific and cultural advancements. However, there were periods of repression as well. During the 8th century, Caliph Umar II introduced laws requiring Jews and Christians to wear identifying clothing. Jews were ordered to wear yellow stars on their necks and hats, while Christians had to wear blue. These clothing regulations, implemented during particularly repressive periods, were designed more to humiliate than to persecute non-Muslims, though they certainly reinforced social hierarchies. The political landscape shifted again in 982 when Caliph Al-Aziz Billah of the Cairo-based Fatimid dynasty conquered the region. The Fatimids were followers of Ismailism, a branch of Shia Islam, and claimed descent from Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. This period saw occasional persecution of non-Muslims, most notably around 1010 when the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. However, Al-Hakim later relented and paid for the church to be rebuilt. In 1020, Al-Hakim claimed divine status, giving rise to the Druze religion, which venerated him as a messiah figure. While the Arab conquest itself was relatively peaceful, the subsequent centuries brought profound demographic changes to Palestine. The region experienced a dramatic population decline, from an estimated 1 million during Roman and Byzantine times to approximately 300,000 by the early Ottoman period. This demographic collapse was accompanied by a gradual process of Islamization resulting from several factors: the emigration of non-Muslim populations, immigration of Muslims, and local conversion. The early Islamic period saw significant population movements. Many Christians and Samaritans from the Byzantine upper class migrated from coastal cities to areas still under Byzantine control, such as northern Syria and Cyprus. Others fled to the Central Highlands and Transjordan. As a result, formerly prosperous coastal towns connected to Mediterranean trade networks were largely emptied of their original inhabitants. Some of these cities, including Ashkelon, Acre, Arsuf, and Gaza, were resettled by Muslim populations who developed them into significant Islamic centers. The region of Samaria underwent particularly notable Islamization through both conversion of the local Samaritan population and the influx of Muslims into the area. The Samaritan community, which had maintained its distinct religious identity for centuries, faced severe challenges during this period, including droughts, earthquakes, religious persecution, heavy taxation, and political instability. Historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that many Samaritans converted to Islam under Abbasid and Tulunid rule. Over time, the Samaritan population drastically decreased, with rural Samaritans largely converting to Islam, while small urban communities persisted in places like Nablus and Caesarea. It's important to note that there is little evidence for forced mass conversion during this period. The Islamization process was gradual and complex, influenced by social, economic, and political factors rather than systematic coercion. The predominantly Jacobite monophysite Christian population, which had been hostile to Byzantine orthodoxy, sometimes welcomed Muslim rule as an alternative to Byzantine religious oppression. While the jizya tax created economic pressure on non-Muslims, there's no strong evidence that it alone drove widespread conversion. Natural disasters also played a role in demographic changes. The devastating earthquake of 749 CE accelerated urban decline in Palestine, prompting many Jews, Christians, and Samaritans to emigrate to diaspora communities. Those who remained in the devastated cities and impoverished villages often eventually converted to Islam. Despite these changes, the Muslim population likely remained a minority in a predominantly Christian area until the Crusader period. The transformation of Palestine from a Christian-majority region to a Muslim-majority one took several centuries, occurring gradually through the complex interplay of migration, conversion, and natural population changes. The early Muslim period established patterns of governance and religious coexistence that would influence the region for centuries. The concept of dhimmi status for Jews and Christians created a framework for religious pluralism, albeit one with clear hierarchies. The architectural transformation of Jerusalem, particularly the construction of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, permanently altered the sacred geography of the city, creating a physical manifestation of Islam's connection to the holy site. For Jewish communities, the early Muslim period brought a significant improvement compared to Byzantine rule. The lifting of the ban on Jewish residents in Jerusalem allowed for a revival of Jewish life in the Holy City. While still subject to various restrictions and special taxation as dhimmis, Jews generally found more religious tolerance under Muslim rule than they had experienced under Christian Byzantine governance. The cultural and intellectual developments of this period were also significant. The Islamic Golden Age saw advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that would later influence European Renaissance thinking. Jewish and Christian scholars often participated in this intellectual flowering, sometimes serving as translators of Greek texts into Arabic and contributing to scientific and philosophical discourse. By the end of the early Muslim period, Palestine had been transformed, politically, demographically, religiously, and culturally. The region had become integrated into the broader Islamic world, with Arabic increasingly becoming the dominant language. Sacred spaces had been reconfigured, with Islamic structures now dominating Jerusalem's skyline alongside Christian churches. Population patterns had shifted, with new urban centers rising in importance while others declined. These changes set the stage for the next dramatic chapter in the region's history, the arrival of the Crusaders in the late 11th century, who would bring European Christian rule to Palestine for the first time and trigger another profound transformation of this constantly contested land. Crusades and Mongols, a turbulent era in Palestine. The year 1095 marked a pivotal turning point in the history of Palestine. Standing before a vast crowd at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II delivered an impassioned speech that would change the course of history. He called upon Christians to wage a holy war, a crusade, to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim rule. His words ignited religious fervor across Europe, launching a series of military campaigns that would dramatically reshape the political and religious landscape of the Middle East. The First Crusade began that same year, as thousands of European knights, soldiers, and pilgrims made the arduous journey eastward. Their stated goal was the liberation of the Holy Land and particularly Jerusalem, which had been under Muslim control for over 4 centuries. After a difficult campaign through Anatolia and Syria, the Crusader armies reached Jerusalem in June 1099. What followed was one of the most infamous episodes in medieval history. After a 5-week siege, the Crusaders breached Jerusalem's walls on July 15, 1099. The conquest quickly descended into a massacre. Contemporary chronicles, both Christian and Muslim, describe the streets running with blood as the Crusaders slaughtered much of the city's Muslim and Jewish population. While these accounts may contain exaggerations, archaeological evidence confirms significant violence occurred. The brutality of the conquest cast a long shadow over Christian-Muslim relations that continues to resonate today. In the same year, Crusader forces also captured Beit Shean and Tiberias. Over the following decade, with crucial support from Italian maritime powers like Venice and Genoa, they seized coastal cities including Acre, Caesarea, and Jaffa. These ports became vital strongholds, connecting the newly established Crusader states to Europe through Mediterranean trade routes. Following their conquests, the Crusaders established several states in the Levant. The most significant was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which held special status among the Crusader realms. At its height, this kingdom stretched from Beirut in the north to the Sinai Peninsula in the south. Jerusalem itself became the capital of this new Christian kingdom, with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as its spiritual center. Despite their military and political control, the Crusaders remained a distinct minority within the population they ruled. The majority of inhabitants were Muslims, along with significant communities of Eastern Christians, Jews, and Samaritans. The Crusader elite established themselves as a feudal aristocracy, relying on the local population to work the land and provide economic support for their rule. The landscape of Palestine was transformed during this period by the construction of massive castles and fortresses. Structures like Crac des Chevaliers in Syria and Montfort Castle in Galilee stand as impressive testaments to Crusader military architecture. However, attempts to establish permanent European farming villages largely failed, highlighting the Crusaders' dependence on the indigenous population. The Crusader states developed a complex legal system that differentiated between various religious and ethnic communities. While Muslims and Jews faced restrictions and special taxation, they were generally allowed to practice their religions. Eastern Christians occupied an intermediate position, with greater rights than Muslims or Jews, but still subordinate to the Latin, Western, Christian elite. By the 1170s, tensions were rising between the Crusader states and their Muslim neighbors. Around 1180, Reynold of Chatillon, the ruler of Transjordan, provoked increasing conflict with the rising Ayyubid Sultan Saladin, Salah al-Din. Reynold's aggressive actions, including attacks on Muslim caravans and threats against Mecca and Medina, provided Saladin with the pretext for war. The decisive confrontation came in July 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, fought on arid hills above the Sea of Galilee near Tiberias. In a brilliant tactical maneuver, Saladin lured the Crusader army away from water sources in the summer heat. The resulting battle was a catastrophic defeat for the Crusaders, with most of their fighting force killed or captured, including the King of Jerusalem. Following this victory, Saladin moved quickly to capitalize on his advantage. Unlike the Crusaders' bloody conquest in 1099, Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in October 1187 was remarkably peaceful. He negotiated the city's surrender, allowed most Christians to leave after paying a ransom, and prohibited violence against the population. This magnanimity enhanced Saladin's reputation in both the Muslim and Christian worlds. An interesting historical footnote: Saladin's court physician during this period was Moses Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish philosophers and legal scholars in history. Maimonides had fled to Egypt from Almohad persecution in Cordoba, Spain, where all non-Muslim religions had been banned. His presence in Saladin's court illustrates the complex religious dynamics of the medieval Middle East, where periods of conflict could coexist with remarkable intellectual and cultural exchange. The Christian world responded to the loss of Jerusalem with the Third Crusade, launched in 1189. This campaign brought three of Europe's most powerful monarchs to the Holy Land: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, who drowned en route, Philip II of France, and Richard I, the Lionheart of England. After lengthy battles and negotiations, Richard and Saladin concluded the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. This agreement granted Christians free passage to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem's holy sites, while the city remained under Muslim rule, a pragmatic compromise that neither side found entirely satisfactory but both could accept. Jerusalem briefly returned to Christian control in 1229 through a remarkable diplomatic achievement rather than military conquest. During the Sixth Crusade, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II negotiated the Treaty of Jaffa and Tel Ajul with Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil. This treaty handed Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to the Christians, while Muslims retained control of the Temple Mount with its Islamic holy sites. Frederick's diplomatic approach, he secured Jerusalem without bloodshed through negotiation, was controversial among both Christians and Muslims, with the emperor even facing excommunication for negotiating with Muslims rather than fighting them. This peaceful arrangement proved short-lived. In 1244, a new threat emerged from the east when Khwarezmian Tatars, Turkish warriors displaced by the Mongol conquests in Central Asia, sacked Jerusalem. The Khwarezmians decimated the city's Christian population, drove out the Jews, and left Jerusalem in ruins. This devastating attack effectively ended meaningful Christian control of Jerusalem during the Crusader period. The Khwarezmians themselves were driven out by Ayyubid forces in 1247. The mid-13th century brought an even greater threat to the entire region, the Mongol Empire. Under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, Mongol forces swept through Persia and Mesopotamia, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate with the sack of Baghdad in 1258. The Mongols then turned their attention to Syria and Palestine, capturing Damascus in 1260 and threatening Egypt. The Mongol advance was finally halted at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in the Jezreel Valley of Galilee in September 1260. There, the Mamluk forces of Egypt, led by Sultan Qutuz and the general Baibars, achieved a decisive victory over the Mongols. This battle marked the first major defeat of a Mongol army and saved Egypt and the remaining Muslim territories from conquest. It also established the Mamluks as the dominant power in the region for the next 2.5 centuries. Following their victory at Ain Jalut, the Mamluks systematically eliminated the remaining Crusader states. Baibars, who became sultan after assassinating Qutuz, captured Caesarea and Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, and Antioch in 1268. The Mamluks employed a deliberate strategy of destroying coastal fortifications to prevent their use by potential future crusaders arriving by sea. The final chapter of the Crusader presence in Palestine came in 1291, when the Mamluks under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil captured Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold. The fall of Acre effectively ended nearly 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Holy Land, though European powers would continue to dream of recovering Jerusalem for centuries to come. The Crusader period left a complex legacy in Palestine. Physically, it transformed the landscape through the construction of massive fortifications, churches, and urban infrastructure. Culturally, it intensified the religious significance of the region for all 3 Abrahamic faiths. Politically, it deepened divisions between Eastern and Western Christianity, while also reshaping Muslim political institutions in response to the Christian threat. For Jewish communities in Palestine, the Crusader period was particularly difficult. The initial Crusader conquest brought violence against Jewish communities, especially in Jerusalem. Under Crusader rule, Jews faced restrictions and were generally marginalized. The period saw a significant decline in the Jewish population of Palestine, though small communities persisted in places like Acre and in Rura, Galilee. As the dust settled on the Crusader era, Palestine entered a new phase under Mamluk rule, a period that would bring relative stability after centuries of conflict, but also new challenges for the diverse religious communities that called this contested land home. Mamluk period, Palestine. Under the Sultans of Egypt. The Mamluk era represents one of the most distinctive chapters in Palestine's long history. To understand this period, we must first understand who the Mamluks were. The term Mamluk literally means owned or possessed in Arabic, referring to their origins as military slaves. These were not ordinary slaves, but children primarily of Turkic origin from Central Asia, purchased and brought to Egypt, where they were converted to Islam and given rigorous military training. This created an elite warrior caste that was fiercely loyal to their masters yet independent of the native Egyptian aristocracy. The Mamluks' rise to power came in the aftermath of the Seventh Crusade, when they seized control of Egypt from the Ayyubid dynasty. Their emergence as the dominant power in the region was cemented in 1260 at the pivotal Battle of Ain Jalut, Goliath's Spring, near Ain Harod in the Jezreel Valley. Here, under the leadership of Sultan Qutuz, Mamluk forces achieved what had previously seemed impossible. They defeated the seemingly invincible Mongol army that had already devastated much of Asia and the Middle East. This victory had profound implications for world history. It marked the first major defeat of a Mongol army and effectively saved Egypt and the remaining Muslim territories from Mongol conquest. It also established the Mamluks as the new masters of Egypt and Syria, including Palestine. The aftermath of the battle brought its own drama. Sultan Qutuz, fresh from his historic victory, was assassinated by one of his generals, Baibars, who then seized power for himself. Baybars would prove to be one of the most effective and ruthless Mamluk sultans, systematically eliminating the remaining Crusader outposts in the region. He captured Caesarea and Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, and Antioch in 1268, employing brutal tactics that spread terror among the Crusader states. The final chapter of the Crusader presence in Palestine came in 1291, when Mamluk forces under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil captured Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold. This effectively ended nearly 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The Mamluks would rule Palestine until 1516, considering it part of Syria rather than a distinct territory. Their administration divided the region into several districts, with governors appointed directly from Cairo. The period between 1258 and 1291 had been particularly devastating for Palestine, as it became the frontier between Mongol invaders, who occasionally allied with Crusader remnants, and the Mamluks of Egypt. This conflict severely impoverished the country and drastically reduced its population. One of the most consequential policies of the Mamluk period was the deliberate destruction of the coastal areas. Continuing a strategy begun under the Ayyubids, the Mamluks made the strategic decision to render uninhabitable many coastal cities from Tyre in the north to Gaza in the south. They destroyed ports and dumped materials to make them inoperable. This scorched earth policy was motivated by fear of a new Crusader invasion from the sea, a reasonable concern given that European powers continued to discuss the possibility of recovering the Holy Land for centuries. This coastal destruction had profound long-term consequences for Palestine's development. Areas that had once been thriving Mediterranean ports remained sparsely populated for centuries afterward. Economic and social activity shifted inland, away from the coast, reversing patterns of settlement that had existed since ancient times. Cities like Ramla, Jerusalem, Hebron, and later Safed became the main centers of population and commerce, while formerly important coastal cities languished. For the diverse religious communities of Palestine, Mamluk rule brought varying experiences. As a militantly Sunni Muslim regime, the Mamluks promoted Orthodox Islam and built numerous religious institutions, including mosques, madrasas, religious schools, and Sufi lodges. They also restored and embellished the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, in Jerusalem, reinforcing its status as a major Islamic holy site. For Christians, particularly those associated with the Crusader states, the Mamluk conquest initially brought hardship and displacement. However, the Mamluks generally allowed Eastern Christian communities to maintain their presence and religious practices, albeit with restrictions and special taxation as dhimmis, protected non-Muslim subjects. Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem continued throughout the Mamluk period, though pilgrims faced various challenges and expenses. The Jewish experience under Mamluk rule was complex. In some respects, conditions were restrictive. In Hebron, for instance, Jews were banned from worshipping at the Cave of the Patriarchs, the second holiest site in Judaism, and were only allowed to enter 7 steps inside the site, a prohibition that would remain in place until 1967. However, the Mamluk period also saw significant developments in Jewish intellectual and religious life, particularly in the later years of their rule. A transformative moment for Palestine's Jewish community came in the late 15th century, following the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 and the persecution of Jews and Muslims by Manuel I of Portugal in 1497. These events triggered a significant eastward migration of Sephardic Jews, with some choosing to settle in Mamluk Palestine. This influx began under late Mamluk rule and accelerated after the Ottoman conquest, bringing new vitality to the local Jewish community. The Sephardic newcomers, coming from the relatively sophisticated urban environments of Spain and Portugal, tended to settle in cities rather than rural areas. They brought with them not only their distinctive religious traditions, but also valuable skills in commerce, crafts, and administration. This migration would have its most profound impact in Safed, which would emerge in the 16th century as a major center of Jewish mysticism and scholarship, though Jerusalem also received significant numbers of Sephardic immigrants. The existing Jewish community in Palestine, known as Musta'arabim, Arabized Jews, had deeper roots in the region and comprised the majority of rural Jewish villagers. These communities had maintained a continuous Jewish presence in the Holy Land through centuries of changing rulers and had developed cultural practices that reflected their long coexistence with the Arab population. The interaction between these established communities and the Sephardic newcomers would create new dynamics within Palestinian Jewish life. Economically, the Mamluk period saw the development of a system that combined imperial control with local autonomy. The Mamluks imposed taxes and maintained military garrisons, but often allowed local leaders to manage day-to-day affairs. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, with grain, olives, and fruits as major crops. Trade routes passing through Palestine connected Egypt with Syria and points beyond, though international commerce was limited compared to earlier periods due to the deliberate destruction of coastal facilities. Architecturally, the Mamluks left a significant legacy in Palestine. Their distinctive style, characterized by alternating layers of light and dark stone, elaborate geometric patterns, and stalactite-like muqarnas decorations, can still be seen in surviving buildings from this period. In Jerusalem, Mamluk structures include the cotton merchants' market, Souk al-Katanin, and numerous religious buildings and fountains. Similar Mamluk architecture can be found in Ramla, Hebron, and other inland cities. The Mamluk system itself contained the seeds of its eventual decline. The practice of purchasing slaves to replenish their ranks meant that Mamluks remained ethnically distinct from the populations they ruled. Over time, corruption, factionalism, and economic problems weakened the Sultanate. The discovery of new maritime routes around Africa by European powers diminished the strategic importance of Mamluk-controlled trade routes. Plague outbreaks, including the Black Death, further weakened their position. By the early 16th century, a new power was rising to the north, the Ottoman Empire. Under the leadership of Sultan Selim I, Ottoman forces defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of Marj Dabik near Aleppo in 1516. The following year, the Ottomans conquered Egypt, bringing an end to Mamluk rule. Palestine, along with the rest of the Mamluk territories, was incorporated into the expanding Ottoman Empire, beginning a new chapter in its history that would last for 4 centuries. The Mamluk period, despite its challenges, left an enduring imprint on Palestine's physical and cultural landscape. Their architectural legacy remains visible in historic urban centers. Their administrative divisions influenced subsequent Ottoman governance. Their deliberate coastal destruction reshaped settlement patterns for centuries, and perhaps most significantly, the late Mamluk period saw the beginnings of the Sephardic migration that would revitalize Jewish life in the Holy Land and set the stage for the flourishing of Jewish mysticism and scholarship in the early Ottoman era. As the Mamluk Sultanate gave way to Ottoman rule in 1516–17, Palestine stood at another historical crossroads, about to enter what would be its longest period under a single imperial power since Roman times. Ottoman period, 4 centuries of Turkish rule in Palestine. In 1516–17, the landscape of power in the Middle East underwent a seismic shift when Turkish Sultan Selim I conquered the Mamluk territories, including Palestine. This conquest marked the beginning of Ottoman rule in the region, a period that would last for 4 centuries, making it the longest continuous imperial control since Roman times. Under the Ottomans, Palestine was not administered as a separate entity, but rather as part of a larger province called Ottoman Syria. Initially, it was incorporated into the Damascus Eyalet province, and following the Tanzimat reorganization of 1864, it became part of the Syria Vilayet. This administrative arrangement reflected the Ottoman view that Palestine was not a distinct territory, but rather an integral part of Greater Syria. The early Ottoman period brought relatively favorable conditions to Palestine compared to the later Mamluk era. The new rulers established a more stable administrative system and generally adopted policies that encouraged economic development and population growth. The Ottomans implemented the millet system, which granted religious minorities significant autonomy in managing their internal affairs while maintaining Ottoman sovereignty. This system provided a framework for the coexistence of diverse religious communities, including Muslims, various Christian denominations, and Jews. For the Jewish community in Palestine, the Ottoman conquest coincided with a pivotal moment in Jewish history, the aftermath of the expulsion from Spain in 1492 and subsequent persecutions in Portugal and other parts of Europe. The migration of Sephardic Jews to Ottoman territories, which had begun under late Mamluk rule, accelerated after the Ottoman conquest. These Sephardic newcomers, with their distinctive religious traditions, languages, primarily Ladino, and cultural practices, soon came to dominate the Jewish community in Palestine, which had previously consisted mainly of Musta'arabim, Arabized Jews, with deep roots in the region. A remarkable chapter in this history unfolded in 1558 when Sultan Selim II, whose wife Nurbanu Sultan was reportedly of Jewish origin, granted control of Tiberias to Doña Gracia Méndez Nasi, one of the wealthiest women in Europe, and herself a refugee from the Spanish Inquisition. This extraordinary woman had built a vast financial empire after escaping persecution, and used her resources to help other Jewish refugees. In Tiberias, she encouraged Jewish settlement and established a Hebrew printing press, laying the groundwork for a Jewish cultural revival in the Galilee. Her nephew, Joseph Nasi, was appointed governor of Tiberias and continued her work, encouraging Jewish immigration, particularly from Italy. During this period, the town of Safed emerged as a major center of Jewish mysticism and scholarship. It became the home of renowned Kabbalists like Isaac Luria and Joseph Caro, author of the Shulchan Aruch, a codification of Jewish law that remains authoritative to this day. The flowering of Jewish mystical thought in 16th century Safed would have a profound and lasting influence on Judaism worldwide. However, this cultural renaissance faced setbacks. In 1660, a power struggle among Druze factions led to the destruction of both Safed and Tiberias, dealing a severe blow to Jewish communities in the Galilee. The region would take decades to recover from this devastation. The 18th century saw the rise of local powers challenging Ottoman authority. Most notably, a local Arab sheikh named Zahir al-Umar created a de facto independent emirate in the Galilee. For several decades, Ottoman attempts to subdue the sheikh failed, but after Zahir's death in 1775, the Ottomans managed to restore their rule in the area. This episode illustrated the weakening grip of the Ottoman center over its provinces, a trend that would continue and accelerate in the 19th century. A brief but significant interruption in Ottoman rule came in 1799, when Napoleon Bonaparte's forces invaded Palestine as part of his Egyptian campaign. Napoleon briefly occupied parts of the country and reportedly planned a proclamation inviting Jews to create a state in Palestine. However, this proclamation was shelved following his defeat at the Siege of Acre, and the French soon withdrew from the region. While short-lived, this episode foreshadowed the increasing European interest in Palestine that would characterize the 19th century. In 1831, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, an Ottoman governor who had established de facto independence and embarked on an ambitious modernization program, conquered Ottoman Syria, including Palestine. His rule brought significant changes, including administrative reforms, tax restructuring, and the imposition of conscription. These policies, particularly conscription, proved deeply unpopular and led to the Arab Revolt of 1834. Muhammad Ali's forces brutally suppressed this uprising, but his control of the region would prove temporary. Under pressure from European powers, particularly Britain, the Egyptians withdrew in 1840, returning Palestine to direct Ottoman governance. The mid-19th century saw renewed interest in Palestine from European Jewish philanthropists. In 1839, Sir Moses Montefiore, a British Jewish banker and philanthropist, met with Muhammad Pasha in Egypt and signed an agreement to establish 200 Jewish villages in the Damascus Eyalet of Ottoman Syria. However, the Egyptian withdrawal the following year meant this ambitious plan was never implemented. Nevertheless, Montefiore continued his efforts to improve conditions for Jews in Palestine, funding agricultural settlements, hospitals, and other institutions during his numerous visits to the region. This period also saw significant demographic changes in Jerusalem. By 1844, Jews constituted the largest population group in the city, though still not an absolute majority. By 1896, however, Jews had become an absolute majority in Jerusalem, a remarkable development given their minority status just decades earlier. This demographic shift resulted from a combination of Jewish immigration and higher natural growth rates among the Jewish population. Despite this change in Jerusalem, the overall population of Palestine remained overwhelmingly Muslim, 88%, and Christian, 9%, with Jews comprising just 3% according to late 19th century estimates. The latter half of the 19th century brought significant transformations to Palestine under Ottoman rule. The Tanzimat reforms, initiated by the Ottoman central government, aimed to modernize the empire and strengthen central control. These reforms included legal changes that provided greater equality before the law for non-Muslims, reorganization of provincial administration, and attempts to improve tax collection and military conscription. While implementation was uneven, these reforms created new opportunities for religious minorities and began to reshape the relationship between the Ottoman state and its subjects. This period also saw increasing European influence in Palestine. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, led to greater European involvement in Ottoman affairs, and various European powers established consulates in Jerusalem, each seeking to protect the interests of their nationals and co-religionists. Christian missionary activity increased, with various denominations establishing schools, hospitals, and churches. European archaeological expeditions began systematic exploration of biblical sites, fueling Western interest in the region's history and geography. For the Jewish community, the late Ottoman period brought both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, the community benefited from the Tanzimat reforms and increasing European protection. On the other hand, they faced economic difficulties and occasional hostility from local authorities. The Jewish population remained concentrated in the four holy cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias, with Jerusalem containing the largest community. This traditional Jewish settlement in Palestine, predating modern Zionism, became known as the Old Yishuv. The character of Jewish immigration began to change in the 1880s with the onset of the First Aliyah, 1882 to 1903, triggered by pogroms in the Russian Empire. Unlike previous Jewish immigrants who came primarily for religious reasons and often relied on charitable support, halukah, these newcomers were influenced by nationalist ideas and sought to establish agricultural settlements. This marked the beginning of modern Zionist settlement in Palestine, though most of these early settlers were not politically motivated Zionists, but rather were seeking refuge from persecution. The Ottoman authorities initially allowed Jewish land purchases and settlement, but became increasingly restrictive as the scale of immigration grew. In 1891, the Ottoman government banned the sale of land to foreign Jews, though this prohibition was often circumvented through various legal mechanisms. Despite these restrictions, by the end of the 19th century, about 30 Jewish agricultural colonies had been established, supported by philanthropists like Baron Edmund de Rothschild. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Palestine remained under Ottoman control, but the seeds of transformation had been planted. European imperial ambitions, the emergence of Arab nationalism, and the growth of the Zionist movement would soon converge to reshape the region's future. The long era of Ottoman rule was drawing to a close, though few could have predicted the dramatic changes that the coming decades would bring to this ancient land at the crossroads of continents and civilizations. Birth of Zionism, the transformation of Palestine. Between 1882 and 1903, a remarkable transformation began in Palestine that would ultimately reshape the region's destiny. During this period, approximately 35,000 Jews moved to Ottoman Palestine in what became known as the First Aliyah, literally ascent or immigration. This movement marked the beginning of modern Jewish settlement in the land and laid the foundations for what would eventually become the State of Israel. To understand this pivotal migration, we must examine its origins in Eastern Europe, particularly the Russian Empire. By the late 19th century, half the world's Jews lived under Russian rule, where they faced severe restrictions. Jews were confined to living in the Pale of Settlement, a western region of the empire where Jewish residence was permitted, and were barred from many professions, educational opportunities, and civic rights. This legal discrimination was punctuated by violent outbreaks against Jewish communities. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 triggered a wave of pogroms-organized violent attacks on Jewish communities across the Russian Empire. The new Tsar, Alexander III, implemented even harsher anti-Jewish legislation known as the May Laws, further restricting Jewish economic activity and education. These deteriorating conditions sparked a massive Jewish emigration from Russia, with approximately 2 million Jews leaving the empire between 1881 and 1914. while the vast majority, about 1.5 million, sought refuge in the United States. Others dispersed to Western Europe, Argentina, and a small but significant number chose Palestine. Among Russian Jews, two movements emerged that focused specifically on settlement in Palestine. Bilu, an acronym from a biblical verse meaning House of Jacob, let us go up, and Hoveve Zion, lovers of Zion. These groups were motivated by a combination of religious attachment to the ancestral homeland, disillusionment with the prospects for Jewish integration in Europe, and a growing sense of national consciousness. Unlike previous Jewish immigrants to Palestine who came primarily for religious reasons and often relied on charitable support, these newcomers sought to establish agricultural settlements and become self-sufficient through productive labor. The first modern Jewish agricultural settlement in Palestine was established in 1878 when Russian Jewish emigrants founded the village of Petah Tikva, the beginning of hope. This was followed by Rishon LeZion, first to Zion, in 1882. These early settlements faced enormous challenges. The pioneers lacked agricultural experience, confronted unfamiliar climate conditions, suffered from malaria in swampy areas, and struggled with financial difficulties. Many early migrants could not find sustainable livelihoods and left. The survival of these early settlements depended heavily on external support, particularly from Baron Edmund James de Rothschild, a French Jewish philanthropist. Rothschild provided crucial funding for land purchases, agricultural equipment, and infrastructure development. He also introduced new agricultural techniques and crops, notably vineyards for wine production. While Rothschild sought to establish profitable enterprises, his financial backing was essential for the settlement's survival during their difficult early years. Despite these challenges, more settlements gradually arose, and the Jewish community in Palestine slowly grew. This new settlement pattern contrasted sharply with the existing Ashkenazi Jewish communities, which were concentrated in the four holy cities, Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. These older communities were extremely poor and relied almost entirely on donations, halukah, from Jewish communities abroad, with residents often devoting themselves to religious study rather than productive labor. The first Aliyah was not limited to Eastern European Jews. After the Ottoman conquest of Yemen in 1881, a significant number of Yemenite Jews also emigrated to Palestine, often driven by messianic beliefs and the desire to return to their ancestral homeland. These Yemenite immigrants brought different cultural traditions and skills, adding to the diversity of the growing Jewish community in Palestine. While these early settlement efforts were underway, the ideological framework of modern political Zionism was being formulated in Europe. In 1896, Theodor Herzl, a Hungarian-born Jewish journalist based in Vienna, published Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State. Having covered the infamous Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jewish military officer was falsely accused of treason amid a wave of anti-Semitism, Herzl became convinced that assimilation was not a viable solution to what was then called the Jewish question in Europe. Instead, he argued that the only effective response to growing anti-Semitism was the establishment of a Jewish state where Jews could live in safety and dignity. Herzl's vision was not initially focused specifically on Palestine. He considered other territories as potential locations for a Jewish state. However, the deep historical and religious connection of Jews to the land of Israel made Palestine the natural focus for the movement he helped launch. In 1897, Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, bringing together Jewish delegates from across Europe and beyond. This Congress founded the World Zionist Organization and proclaimed its aim to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured under public law. The Congress chose Hatikva, the Hope, as its anthem, a song expressing the age-old Jewish yearning to return to Zion, which would later become the national anthem of Israel. The Zionist movement that emerged from the Basel Congress differed from earlier Jewish settlement efforts in Palestine in its explicitly political character. While previous settlers had focused primarily on creating agricultural communities, Herzl and his colleagues sought diplomatic recognition and legal guarantees for Jewish settlement. Herzl himself engaged in diplomatic efforts, meeting with the Ottoman Sultan, the German Kaiser, and British officials to seek support for the Zionist project. Between 1904 and 1914, a second wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine occurred, known as the Second Aliyah. During this period, around 40,000 Jews settled in the area, many fleeing renewed persecution in the Russian Empire, particularly following the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. Unlike the first Aliyah immigrants, who were primarily traditional and religiously motivated, many second Aliyah immigrants were influenced by socialist ideologies and sought to create a new type of Jewish society based on collective labor and communal living. This period saw the establishment of the first kibbutz, collective settlement, Degania, in 1909, and the development of new institutions to support Jewish settlement. In 1908, the World Zionist Organization established the Palestine Bureau, also known as the Eretz Israel Office, in Jaffa, and began to adopt a more systematic approach to Jewish settlement, coordinating land purchases and immigrant absorption. A significant milestone occurred in 1909 when residents of Jaffa purchased land outside the city walls and built Ahuzat Bayit, the first entirely Hebrew-speaking town, which was later renamed Tel Aviv. This marked the beginning of modern Jewish urban development in Palestine, creating a space where the vision of Hebrew cultural revival could be realized. While these developments were unfolding in Palestine, the broader region was experiencing significant upheaval. In 1915 to 1916, during World War I, the Ottoman authorities under Talat Pasha carried out what is now recognized as the Armenian Genocide. Around 1 million Armenian Christians were forcibly removed from their homes in eastern Turkey and marched south through Syria. An estimated 700,000 died from starvation, disease, and outright killings, while hundreds of thousands were forcibly converted to Islam. A community of survivors eventually settled in Jerusalem, where they made notable contributions to local culture, including the development of the now iconic Armenian pottery that remains a distinctive feature of Jerusalem's artistic heritage. The birth of Zionism and the early waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine occurred within the context of the declining Ottoman Empire. Ottoman authorities initially allowed Jewish settlement but became increasingly restrictive as they recognized the potential political implications of Zionist ambitions. In 1891, the Ottoman government banned the sale of land to foreign Jews, though this prohibition was often circumvented through various legal mechanisms. By the eve of World War I, the Jewish population in Palestine had grown to approximately 85,000, or about 12% of the total population. While still a minority, this community had established the foundations of what Zionists called the Yishuv settlement, a network of agricultural colonies, urban neighborhoods, educational institutions, and economic enterprises that would form the nucleus of a future Jewish state. The indigenous Arab population of Palestine initially had limited interaction with the new Jewish settlements, which remained relatively small and isolated. However, as Jewish land purchases expanded and the political nature of Zionism became more apparent, tensions began to emerge. Local Arab notables started to express concerns about the long-term implications of Zionist settlement, though organized Arab nationalism in Palestine was still in its infancy. World War I would soon bring dramatic changes to Palestine, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman rule and creating new political realities that would accelerate both the Zionist project and Arab nationalist aspirations. The collision of these movements would shape the region's history for the century to come, leading to one of the world's most intractable conflicts. But in these early years of Zionist settlement, few could have predicted the full magnitude of the transformation that had begun in this small corner of the Ottoman Empire. World War I, Palestine at the crossroads of global conflict. World War I marked a decisive turning point in the history of Palestine, transforming it from a relatively obscure Ottoman province into the focus of international diplomacy and competing nationalist aspirations. The war's outcome would end 4 centuries of Ottoman rule and set the stage for the complex conflicts that continue to shape the region today. When war erupted in 1914, Palestine remained under Ottoman control, with the empire choosing to ally itself with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. This decision would prove fateful for Ottoman rule in the Middle East. For the Jewish community in Palestine, the outbreak of war created an immediate dilemma. Most Jews worldwide initially supported Germany because they were fighting Russia, which was widely regarded as the Jews' main enemy due to its long history of anti-Semitic policies and pogroms. However, this sentiment would shift dramatically as the war progressed. The war brought immediate hardship to Palestine's Jewish community. In 1914 to 1915, the Ottoman military commander expelled over 14,000 Jews from the Jaffa area, citing suspicions that they were either Russian subjects and thus enemy aliens, or Zionists seeking to detach Palestine from Ottoman control. The situation worsened in April 1917 when the entire population of both Jaffa and Tel Aviv Muslims and Jews alike was subject to an expulsion order. Many of the affected Jews could not return until the British conquest ended Ottoman rule in 1918. Meanwhile, in Britain, the government began to see potential strategic value in supporting Zionist aspirations. This shift was motivated by several factors. There was an anti-Semitic perception of Jewish power in the Ottoman Empire's Young Turks movement, which had significant roots in Thessaloniki, at that time the most Jewish city in Europe, where 40% of the 160,000 population was Jewish. British officials also hoped to secure American Jewish support for U.S. intervention on Britain's behalf, and to preempt what they feared might be German support for Zionism. Additionally, there was already sympathy for Zionist aims within the British government, including from Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who had previously worked as a lawyer for the Zionist movement, and Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, who had long-standing interest in the Jewish question. The influential British diplomat Mark Sykes became a strong advocate for an alliance with Zionism, seeing it as beneficial to British imperial interests in the Middle East. These considerations culminated in the Balfour Declaration of November 2, 1917, when Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour sent a public letter to Lord Rothschild, a leading member of his party and prominent figure in the British Jewish community. The letter stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while adding that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This carefully worded document, just 67 words long, would have profound and lasting consequences. For Zionists, it represented the first official recognition of their aspirations by a major power. For Britain, it provided a pretext for claiming and governing Palestine after the war. For the Arab population, who constituted about 90% of Palestine's inhabitants at the time, the declaration made no mention of political rights or self-determination, foreshadowing the conflicts to come. The Balfour Declaration did not emerge in isolation, but was part of a complex web of often contradictory wartime diplomacy. While Britain was promising support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, it was simultaneously making commitments to Arab leaders and reaching secret agreements with France about the post-war division of Ottoman territories. In 1915, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, had exchanged letters with Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, suggesting British support for Arab independence in exchange for an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. The precise geographical scope of these promises remains contested, with debate over whether Palestine was included or excluded from the areas promised to the Arabs. Meanwhile, Britain and France had secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, dividing much of the Middle East into British and French spheres of influence. Under this agreement, Palestine was to be placed under international administration, with Britain and France playing key roles. These conflicting promises, to Zionists, to Arab leaders, and to European allies, laid the groundwork for decades of conflict. As historian David Fromkin aptly titled his book on the subject, Britain was effectively promising a peace to end all peace. On the military front, the war in Palestine began in earnest in 1917, when British forces under General Edmund Allenby launched a campaign from Egypt into Ottoman Palestine. A Jewish legion, composed largely of Zionist volunteers organized by Ze'ev Jabotinsky and Joseph Trumpeldor, participated in this British invasion. Many of these volunteers were Russian Jews who had been expelled from Palestine by the Ottomans and had regrouped in Egypt. The legion also included volunteers from Britain, the United States, and Canada. Zionist support for the British war effort extended beyond direct military participation. The Neely Spy Network, a Jewish espionage organization led by agronomist Aaron Aronson and his sister Sarah, provided the British with valuable intelligence about Ottoman troop movements and defense plans. The group's activities were eventually discovered by Ottoman authorities, leading to the arrest and torture of several members, including Sarah Aronson, who committed suicide rather than risk revealing information under torture. Simultaneously, Britain was supporting the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. In 1916, Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, declared independence from Ottoman rule and, with British support, launched a rebellion. His son Faisal led Arab forces northward alongside British officers, including the famous T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. Britain supplied the Arab forces with substantial quantities of rifles, ammunition, and gold. The Arab revolt achieved significant successes, including the capture of Aqaba on the Red Sea in July 1917. The Arab army then continued northward while Britain attacked the Ottomans from the Mediterranean. In December 1917, British forces captured Jerusalem, the first time the city had changed hands in centuries. General Allenby famously entered the city on foot as a sign of respect for its religious significance. By October 1918, Damascus had fallen, effectively ending Ottoman rule in the Levant. However, the post-war settlement would dash Arab hopes for independence. It became clear that Britain had already entered into the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement with France, dividing the former Ottoman territories between the two European powers. Instead of the independent Arab state that had been promised, the Middle East was carved into mandates administered by Britain and France. After the Ottoman surrender in October 1918, Palestine came under British military administration. The Occupied Enemy Territory Administration, OETA, governed the area until the formal establishment of the British Mandate in 1920. During this transitional period, the foundations were laid for the mandate system that would govern Palestine for the next 3 decades. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 formalized the new order in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled, with its Arab provinces placed under European control through the mandate system of the newly formed League of Nations. Britain received the mandates for Palestine, including what is now Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jordan, and Iraq, while France received Syria and Lebanon. The mandate for Palestine, confirmed by the League of Nations in 1922, incorporated the Balfour Declaration and charged Britain with placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home. It also required Britain to facilitate Jewish immigration, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced. This inherently contradictory mandate set the stage for increasing tensions between the growing Jewish community and the Arab majority. The British would spend the next 3 decades attempting to balance these competing claims, ultimately satisfying neither side and setting the stage for the conflicts that would follow their withdrawal. World War I thus transformed Palestine from a relatively peaceful backwater of the Ottoman Empire into the focus of competing nationalist aspirations and great power politics. The decisions made during and immediately after the war, particularly the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the British Mandate, created a framework that would shape the region's development for decades to come. The seeds of the Arab-Israeli conflict were sown in these wartime diplomacy and post-war arrangements, creating a legacy that continues to influence the region to this day. As British forces consolidated their control over Palestine in late 1918, they could not have foreseen that their temporary administration would last for 3 decades, or that their departure would be followed by a conflict that remains unresolved more than a century later. The Great War had ended, but for Palestine, a new and turbulent chapter was just beginning. Mandatory Palestine, the British era. The British Mandate for Palestine, officially confirmed by the League of Nations in 1922 and implemented in 1923, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history. This international legal instrument formalized British control over the territories that had been part of Ottoman Syria, encompassing what is now Israel, the Palestinian territories, and Jordan. The mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration's commitment to a Jewish national home, while also requiring Britain to safeguard the rights of the non-Jewish population. It's important to note that Transjordan, modern-day Jordan, was also technically part of the mandate, but operated under separate rules that explicitly excluded it from the provisions of the Balfour Declaration. This administrative division would later become permanent, with Transjordan gaining independence in 1946 as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The mandate received broad international support. The United States, though not a member of the League of Nations, signed a treaty with Britain endorsing the terms of the mandate, which was approved unanimously by both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. This American endorsement would prove significant in later decades as the United States became increasingly involved in the region. The timing of the Balfour Declaration on November 2, 1917, coincided with momentous events in world history. Just a week later, the Bolsheviks seized control of Russia, plunging the former Russian Empire into a devastating civil war. Between 1918 and 1921, a series of pogroms in the territories of the former Russian Empire, particularly in what is now Ukraine, led to the deaths of at least 100,000 Jews and displaced a further 600,000 as refugees. This catastrophe accelerated Jewish migration to Palestine, with approximately 40,000 Jews arriving between 1919 and 1923 in what became known as the Third Aliyah. Many of these Jewish immigrants were socialist Zionists who had supported the Bolsheviks and brought with them revolutionary ideals about creating a new society. They became known as pioneers, halutzim, often trained in agriculture and committed to physical labor and self-sufficiency. This wave of immigration saw the establishment of the first kibbutzim collective agricultural settlements that would become iconic symbols of the Zionist enterprise. These communities undertook ambitious land reclamation projects, draining malarial marshes in the Jezreel Valley and Heifer Plain and converting them to agricultural use. The land for these settlements was purchased by the Jewish National Fund, JNF, a Zionist organization established in 1901 to buy and develop land in Palestine for Jewish settlement. The JNF collected donations from Jews worldwide, purchasing land primarily from absentee Arab landowners. By the terms of its charter, land acquired by the JNF could not be sold or leased to non-Jews, establishing a pattern of separate development that would have long-term consequences. The early years of the mandate saw increasing tensions between the Jewish and Arab communities. In April 1920, during the Nebi Musa festival in Jerusalem, riots broke out, resulting in deaths and injuries on both sides. The following year, more serious violence erupted in Jaffa. These clashes led to the establishment of the Haganah, an underground Jewish militia created to defend Jewish settlements. Initially a loose network of local defense groups, the Haganah would eventually evolve into the core of the Israel Defense Forces. To manage Jewish immigration and settlement, a Jewish agency was created as stipulated in the mandate. This body issued the entry permits granted by the British authorities and distributed funds donated by Jews abroad. It effectively functioned as a proto-government for the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine. Between 1924 and 1929, over 80,000 Jews arrived in Palestine in what is known as the Fourth Aliyah. Unlike the ideologically motivated pioneers of the Third Aliyah, many of these immigrants were middle-class Jews fleeing anti-Semitism and heavy tax burdens imposed on Jewish businesses in Poland and Hungary. Their migration was also influenced by the closure of United States borders following the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely limited immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. This period saw significant development in the Yishuv's infrastructure and institutions. Pinchas Rutenberg, a former commissar of St. Petersburg in Russia's pre-Bolshevik Kerensky government, received a concession from the British to build electric power stations. In 1925, the Jewish agency established the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the Technion, Technological University, in Haifa, creating centers for higher education and research. In 1927, British authorities introduced the Palestine pound as the official currency, replacing the Egyptian pound. From 1928, the democratically elected Va'ad Leumi, Jewish National Council, or JNC, became the main administrative institution of the Yishuv. This body included both Zionist and non-Zionist Jews and gradually took on government-like functions, including education, healthcare, and security. With British permission, the Va'ad Leumi raised its own taxes and operated independent services for the Jewish population, creating a state within a state that would later form the foundation for Israeli governance. In 1929, tensions escalated over access to the Western Wall, Kotel, Judaism's holiest site. The wall, then a narrow alleyway, was subject to restrictions imposed by the British, who prohibited Jews from using chairs or curtains during prayers. Many worshippers were elderly and needed seats, and there was also a desire to separate men and women according to Jewish religious practice. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, claimed the area as Muslim property and allegedly had cattle driven through the alley to disrupt Jewish prayers. He also spread rumors that Jews were seeking control of the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif above the wall. These tensions provided the spark for the August 1929 Palestine riots, which spread throughout the country. The most notorious incident occurred in Hebron, where 67 Jews were massacred, and the ancient Jewish community, which had lived there for centuries and was largely non-Zionist, was destroyed. The riots led to increased militarization on both sides. In 1931, right-wing Zionists established their own militia, the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, National Military Organization, known by its Hebrew acronym Etzel, which advocated a more aggressive policy toward the Arab population than the Haganah's defensive posture. During this interwar period, it became increasingly apparent that there was an irreconcilable tension between the two core functions of the mandate, providing for a Jewish homeland in Palestine while preparing the country for self-determination. The British rejected the principle of majority rule or any other measure that would give the Arab population, who formed the majority, control over Palestinian territory. This fundamental contradiction would ultimately make the mandate unworkable. Between 1929 and 1938, approximately 250,000 Jews arrived in Palestine in what is known as the Fifth Aliyah. This massive wave of immigration was largely driven by the rise of Nazism in Germany and increasing anti-Semitism throughout Europe. In 1933, the Jewish Agency and Nazi Germany negotiated the Ha'avara Agreement, transfer agreement, under which 50,000 German Jews would be transferred to Palestine. Under this controversial arrangement, Jews' possessions were confiscated by the Nazi regime, and in return, the Ha'avara organization was permitted to purchase £14 million worth of German goods for export to Palestine, using the proceeds to compensate the immigrants. The agreement was highly contentious within the Jewish community, with many opposing any dealings with the Nazi regime. Haim Arlosoroff, the labor Zionist leader who negotiated the agreement, was assassinated in Tel Aviv in 1933 shortly after returning from Germany. His murder remains unsolved, though it was used by the British to create tension between the Zionist left and right. There has been speculation about various perpetrators, including the possibility of Nazi involvement due to Arlosoroff's past relationship with Magda Ritschl, who later married Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, but no conclusive evidence has emerged. Between 1933 and 1936, approximately 174,000 Jews arrived in Palestine, despite the substantial financial requirements imposed by the British for immigration permits. Jews had to prove they possessed £1,000 for families with capital, a very large sum at the time, £500 for professionals, or £250 for skilled laborers. These requirements effectively limited immigration to those with financial means, excluding many of the most vulnerable Jews in Europe. The rapid increase in Jewish immigration, combined with land purchases and the growing institutional strength of the Yishuv, alarmed the Arab population. Nazi propaganda, which sought to inflame Arab sentiment against Jews and the British, contributed to tensions. These factors culminated in the large-scale Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a nationalist uprising directed primarily at ending British rule and halting Jewish immigration. The head of the Jewish Agency, David Ben-Gurion, responded to the Arab Revolt with a policy of havlaga, self-restraint, refusing to be provoked by Arab attacks to prevent further polarization. This policy was controversial within the Yishuv, and the Irgun broke away from the Haganah in opposition to this approach, advocating for more aggressive retaliation. The British responded to the revolt by appointing the Peel Commission, 1936-37, to investigate its causes and propose solutions. The commission recommended a radical partition plan, creating an exclusively Jewish territory in the Galilee and western coast, including the transfer of 225,000 Arabs from these areas, and an exclusively Arab area in the rest of Palestine, with Britain retaining control of Jerusalem and a corridor to the sea. The two main Jewish leaders, Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, convinced the Zionist Congress to approve the Peel recommendations equivocally as a basis for further negotiation, recognizing that it offered the first official proposal for a Jewish state. However, the plan was rejected outright by the Palestinian Arab leadership, who renewed the revolt. Faced with escalating violence, the British ultimately abandoned the plan as unworkable. Testifying before the Peel Commission, Weizmann made a statement that would prove tragically prophetic. There are in Europe 6 million people, for whom the world is divided into places where they cannot live and places where they cannot enter. By 1938, the plight of European Jews had become so dire that U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called an international conference at Evian, France, to address the refugee crisis. Britain made its attendance contingent on Palestine being kept off the discussion table, and no Jewish representatives were invited. The conference proved largely fruitless, with most countries refusing to increase their immigration quotas. The Nazi regime cynically proposed its own solution, that the Jews of Europe be shipped to Madagascar, the Madagascar Plan, a proposal that was never implemented. With millions of Jews desperately trying to leave Europe and virtually every country in the world closing its doors to Jewish refugees, the British made the fateful decision to effectively close Palestine as well. The White Paper of 1939 recommended that an independent Palestine, governed jointly by Arabs and Jews, be established within 10 years. It allowed for 75,000 Jewish immigrants to enter Palestine over the period 1940 to 44, after which further migration would require Arab approval. In March 1940, the British High Commissioner for Palestine issued an edict banning Jews from purchasing land in 95% of Palestine. Both the Arab and Jewish leadership rejected the White Paper, though for different reasons. For the Zionist movement, it represented a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate's commitment to a Jewish national home. For the Arab leadership, it did not go far enough in immediately halting Jewish immigration and land purchases. With legal immigration severely restricted, Jews now resorted to illegal immigration, known as Aliyah Bet or Ha'apala. These operations were often organized by the Mossad Le'aliyah Bet, an agency specifically created for this purpose, and the Irgun. However, with no outside help and no countries willing to admit them, very few Jews managed to escape Europe between 1939 and 1945. Those caught by the British attempting to enter Palestine illegally were mostly imprisoned in detention camps in Cyprus or Mauritius. The White Paper policy, implemented just as World War II was beginning and the Holocaust was about to unfold, would have profound consequences. It effectively closed one of the few potential havens for European Jews at the moment of their greatest peril. This timing would later fuel the determination of the Yishuv to establish an independent Jewish state that could control its own immigration policy and serve as a refuge for persecuted Jews worldwide. The mandatory period thus set the stage for the conflicts that would follow. It saw the development of parallel societies with separate institutions, economies, and aspirations. The Jewish community built the foundations of a state, with political institutions, armed forces, educational systems, and economic infrastructure, while the Arab community increasingly mobilized in opposition to both British rule and Zionist settlement. The inherent contradictions in the mandate's dual obligations created a situation that would ultimately prove impossible for the British to manage, leading to their withdrawal in 1948 and the war that followed. World War II and the Holocaust, the darkest chapter. World War II and the Holocaust represent the darkest chapter in Jewish history and had profound implications for Palestine and the Zionist movement. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the Jewish Agency worked to establish a Jewish army that would fight alongside British forces against Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill supported this plan, recognizing both its military value and its political significance. However, opposition from the British military establishment and government officials led to its rejection. Instead, the British insisted on a policy of parity, demanding that the number of Jewish recruits match the number of Arab recruits, despite the much greater eagerness of the Jewish community to participate in the war effort. When Italy declared war on the British Commonwealth in June 1940 and sided with Nazi Germany, the conflict directly reached Palestine. Within a month, Italian planes bombed Tel Aviv and Haifa, causing multiple casualties and bringing the European war to the Middle East. The threat intensified in May 1941, when German forces under General Erwin Rommel began their North African campaign, raising the specter of a Nazi invasion of Palestine. In response, the Haganah established the Palmach, an elite strike force created specifically to defend the Yishuv, Jewish community, against the planned Axis invasion through North Africa. The British refusal to provide arms to the Jews, even when Rommel's forces were advancing through Egypt in June 1942 with the intent of occupying Palestine, combined with the restrictive 1939 White Paper, led to growing disillusionment with Britain among the Zionist leadership. Many came to believe that conflict with Britain was inevitable once the war against Nazi Germany was won. Despite this tension, the Jewish Agency called on Palestine's Jewish youth to volunteer for the British Army, emphasizing the existential threat posed by Nazism. Approximately 30,000 Palestinian Jews and 12,000 Palestinian Arabs enlisted in the British armed forces during the war. The Jewish Brigade, a fighting force under Jewish command and flying a Jewish flag alongside the British flag, was finally established in June 1944 after years of Zionist lobbying. The brigade fought in Italy and later played a crucial role in helping Holocaust survivors reach Palestine. Beyond Palestine, approximately 1.5 million Jews around the world served in every branch of the Allied armies, with particularly large numbers in the Soviet and U.S. forces. The human cost was enormous. 200,000 Jews died serving in the Soviet army alone. While the mainstream Zionist leadership supported the Allied war effort, a small group of militants took a different approach. About 200 activists broke away from the Irgun, which had suspended its anti-British activities for the duration of the war, and formed the Lehi Stern Gang, led by Avraham Stern. This group, viewing Britain as an enemy equal to Nazi Germany, sought contacts with the Axis powers on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, a highly controversial position that was rejected by the vast majority of the Yishuv. In 1942, the USSR released the revisionist Zionist leader Menachem Begin from the Gulag, and he made his way to Palestine, taking command of the Irgun. Begin maintained the organization's suspension of anti-British operations until the defeat of Nazi Germany, but prepared for conflict afterward. Around the same time, Yitzhak Shamir escaped from the British detention camp in Eritrea, where Lehi activists were being held without trial, assuming command of the Lehi after Stern's killing by British police in 1942. Jews throughout the Middle East were also affected by the war. Most of North Africa came under Nazi control, either directly or through the Vichy French regime, and many Jews were used as slave laborers in work camps. In Iraq, a pro-Axis coup in 1941 was accompanied by the Farhud, a violent pogrom against Baghdad's Jewish community that killed hundreds. The Jewish Agency developed contingency plans for a last stand in the event of Rommel invading Palestine, as Nazi documents later revealed plans to exterminate Palestine's Jews as part of the final solution. Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis, aided by local collaborators in occupied countries, led systematic efforts to kill every person of Jewish extraction in Europe, what would come to be known as the Holocaust or Shoah. This genocide resulted in the deaths of approximately 6 million Jews, about 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. A quarter of those killed were children. The Polish and German Jewish communities, which had played central roles in defining the pre-1945 Jewish world, were virtually destroyed. The Holocaust fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of world Jewry. In the United States and Palestine, Jews of European origin became disconnected from their families and roots. As the Holocaust primarily affected Ashkenazi Jews, those of Central and Eastern European origin, Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, those from the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa, who had previously been a minority within global Jewry, became a much more significant factor in the Jewish world. Those Jews who survived in Central and Eastern Europe became displaced persons, refugees, often living in camps established by the Allies. An Anglo-American committee of inquiry, established to examine the Palestine issue in the aftermath of the war, surveyed the ambitions of these survivors and found that over 95% wanted to migrate to Palestine. Having experienced the failure of European emancipation and assimilation, most survivors saw a Jewish state as their only hope for the future. The Holocaust and Britain's restrictive policies during this period had profound effects on the Zionist movement. Chaim Weizmann, the moderate pro-British leader and British citizen who had been instrumental in securing the Balfour Declaration, found his position undermined by Britain's anti-Zionist policies, despite his personal sacrifice of losing a son who died flying in the Royal Air Force. Leadership of the movement increasingly passed to the Jewish Agency in Palestine, now led by the Socialist Zionist Mapai Party under David Ben-Gurion, which took a more assertive stance toward British rule. The Holocaust transformed the Zionist movement in several crucial ways. First, it eliminated the demographic center of world Jewry in Eastern Europe, which had been both a source of immigrants to Palestine and a base of support for the Zionist movement. Second, it created a massive refugee problem that lent moral urgency to the Zionist cause. Third, it discredited, in the eyes of many Jews, both the assimilationist path in the diaspora and the idea that Jews could rely on the protection of other nations. Finally, it strengthened the determination of the Yishuv to achieve independence and control over immigration policy, seeing this as literally a matter of life and death for the Jewish people. The Holocaust also changed international perceptions of the Jewish plight and the Zionist cause. Many world leaders and ordinary citizens who had previously been indifferent or opposed to Zionism came to see the establishment of a Jewish state as a moral imperative after witnessing the catastrophe that had befallen European Jewry. This shift in international opinion would play a crucial role in the events leading to the establishment of Israel in 1948. For the Jewish community in Palestine, the Holocaust created a profound sense of guilt among those who had escaped Europe before the Nazi rise to power or who had been born in Palestine. Many felt they had not done enough to rescue their European brethren. This survivor's guilt would become an important element in Israeli national psychology and would influence the country's approach to security issues for generations to come. The Holocaust also had significant implications for the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine. While some Arab leaders, most notably the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, had collaborated with the Nazis and expressed support for their anti-Semitic policies, the majority of Arabs in Palestine had little awareness of the full extent of the Holocaust during the war years. After the war, many Arabs viewed the increased international support for Zionism as making them indirect victims of European anti-Semitism and Nazi crimes in which they had played no part. As the full scale of the Holocaust became known in 1945, the Yishuv and the Zionist movement worldwide became more determined than ever to establish a Jewish state that could serve as a refuge for survivors and prevent any future genocide. The British, however, maintained the restrictive immigration policies of the 1939 White Paper, even as hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors languished in displaced persons camps in Europe. This situation set the stage for the intense conflict that would follow the war's end, with the Yishuv increasingly turning to armed resistance against British rule, Holocaust survivors attempting to reach Palestine through illegal immigration, and the international community grappling with how to resolve the competing claims to Palestine in the shadow of the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history: illegal Jewish immigration and the path to partition. The end of World War II marked a pivotal transition in the struggle for Palestine. The British Empire, severely weakened by the war, faced new geopolitical realities. In the Middle East, Britain had become acutely conscious of its dependence on Arab oil, with British firms controlling Iraqi petroleum and British rule extending over Kuwait, Bahrain, and the Emirates. This economic consideration would significantly influence British policy in the region. Shortly after VE Day in May 1945, the Labour Party won the general election in Britain, replacing Winston Churchill's Conservative government. This political shift initially raised hopes among Zionists, as Labour Party conferences had for years passed resolutions calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. However, once in power, Clement Attlee's Labor government decided to maintain the restrictive policies of the 1939 White Paper, prioritizing strategic imperial interests over previous party positions. With legal immigration channels effectively closed, illegal migration, known as Aliyah Bet, became the main form of Jewish entry into Palestine. Across Europe, an organization called Brecha, Flight, composed largely of former partisans and ghetto fighters, established an underground railroad to smuggle Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe to Mediterranean ports. From there, small boats attempted to breach the British naval blockade of Palestine. Meanwhile, Jews from Arab countries began moving into Palestine overland, often facing less scrutiny than European Jews arriving by sea. The British responded with increasingly harsh measures to prevent Jewish immigration. Ships carrying refugees were intercepted, and their passengers were either returned to Europe or interned in detention camps in Cyprus. The most infamous incident occurred in July 1947, when the British seized the SS Exodus 1947, carrying more than 4,500 Holocaust survivors, and forcibly returned its passengers to Germany. Images of British troops removing Holocaust survivors from the ship at Hamburg created an international public relations disaster for Britain and galvanized support for the Zionist cause. Despite British efforts to curb immigration during the 14 years of the Aliyah Bet operation, over 110,000 Jews managed to enter Palestine. By the end of World War II, the Jewish population of Palestine had increased to 33% of the total population, creating demographic realities that would significantly influence the political future of the region. In an effort to win independence, Zionist groups now waged an increasingly aggressive guerrilla war against the British. The main underground Jewish militia, the Haganah, formed an alliance called the Jewish Resistance Movement with the more militant Irgun, Etzel, and Lehi, Stern Gang, to fight the British. Their campaign included attacks on infrastructure, such as the Night of the Bridges in June 1946, when the Haganah destroyed 11 bridges connecting Palestine to neighboring countries. The British responded with Operation Agatha, a massive police and military operation that resulted in the arrest of 2,700 Jews, including much of the leadership of the Jewish Agency, whose headquarters were raided. Those arrested were held without trial, further inflaming tensions. On July 4, 1946, a pogrom in Kielce, Poland, in which 42 Jews were killed and many more wounded, led to a new wave of Holocaust survivors fleeing Europe for Palestine. This violence, occurring more than a year after the end of the war, demonstrated to many Jews that Europe remained unsafe even after the defeat of Nazism. 3 weeks after the Kielce pogrom, on July 22, 1946, the Irgun bombed the British administrative and military headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people, including British, Arab, and Jewish civilians and officials. This attack, the deadliest of the Jewish insurgency, was condemned by the mainstream Jewish leadership. In the days following the bombing, Tel Aviv was placed under curfew, and over 120,000 Jews, nearly 20% of the Jewish population of Palestine, were questioned by the police. The alliance between the Haganah and the Irgun was dissolved after the King David Hotel bombing, with the Haganah returning to its policy of restraint, havlaga, in the use of force. In the United States, Congress criticized British handling of the situation in Palestine and considered delaying loans that were vital to British post-war recovery. American public opinion, influenced by awareness of the Holocaust and images of Jewish refugees being turned away from Palestine, increasingly favored the Zionist position. Between 1945 and 1948, approximately 120,000 Jews left Poland. Their departure was largely organized by Zionist activists under the umbrella of the semi-clandestine organization Brecha, Flight. Brecha was also responsible for the organized emigration of Jews from Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, totaling about 250,000 Holocaust survivors, including those from Poland. The British imprisoned Jews trying to enter Palestine illegally in the Atlit detainee camp in Palestine itself and in internment camps in Cyprus. Those held were mainly Holocaust survivors, including large numbers of children and orphans. In response to Cypriot fears that the Jews would never leave, since they lacked a state or documentation, and because the 75,000 quota established by the 1939 White Paper had never been filled. The British allowed the refugees to enter Palestine at a rate of 750 per month, a number far below the scale of the humanitarian crisis. By 1947, the Labour government in Britain, facing mounting international criticism, economic difficulties at home, and an increasingly costly and violent situation in Palestine, was ready to refer the Palestine problem to the newly created United Nations. On April 2, 1947, the United Kingdom formally requested that the question of Palestine be handled by the UN General Assembly. The General Assembly responded by creating the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, composed of representatives from 11 countries, to investigate the situation and make recommendations. In July 1947, UNSCOP visited Palestine and met with Jewish and Zionist delegations. The Arab Higher Committee, the main political body representing Palestinian Arabs, boycotted the meetings, a decision that would limit Arab influence on the committee's recommendations. During the UNSCOP visit, British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin ordered that passengers from the Aliyah Bet ship SS Exodus 1947 be sent back to Europe. The Holocaust-surviving migrants on the ship were forcibly removed by British troops at Hamburg, Germany, creating scenes that shocked the world and influenced the UNSCOP delegates. An interesting development during this period was the position taken by the principal non-Zionist Orthodox Jewish or Haredi party, Agudat Israel. While historically opposed to political Zionism on religious grounds, Agudat Israel recommended to UNSCOP that a Jewish state be set up after reaching a religious status quo agreement with David Ben-Gurion regarding the future Jewish state. This pragmatic compromise, known as the Status Quo Agreement, granted an exemption from military service to a quota of yeshiva, religious seminary students, and to all Orthodox women, made the Sabbath the national weekend, guaranteed kosher food in government institutions, and allowed Orthodox Jews to maintain a separate education system. This agreement would have lasting implications for the relationship between religion and state in Israel. After extensive deliberations, the majority report of UNSCOP proposed an independent Arab state, an independent Jewish state, and the city of Jerusalem, the last to be under an international trusteeship system. On November 29, 1947, in Resolution 181-2, the UN General Assembly adopted the majority report of UNSCOP, but with slight modifications. The plan called for the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem as an international city. It also called for the British to allow substantial Jewish migration by February 1, 1948. The Jewish Agency, representing the Yishuv, accepted the partition plan, despite disappointment with the territorial limitations of the proposed Jewish state. The Arab Higher Committee and the Arab League rejected it outright, insisting on a unitary Arab state in all of Palestine. Neither Britain nor the UN Security Council took any action to implement the recommendation made by the resolution, and Britain continued detaining Jews attempting to enter Palestine. Concerned that partition would severely damage Anglo-Arab relations, Britain denied UN representatives access to Palestine during the period between the adoption of Resolution 181 and the termination of the British mandate. The British withdrawal was finally completed in May 1948. However, Britain continued to hold Jewish immigrants of fighting age and their families on Cyprus until March 1949, months after Israeli independence. The period between the UN partition vote in November 1947 and the British withdrawal in May 1948 was marked by increasing violence between Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine. As the British began to withdraw from strategic areas, both sides sought to control territory and establish facts on the ground. The first phase of what would become Israel's War of Independence, or the Palestinian Nakba, catastrophe from the Arab perspective, had begun. The British Mandate, which had begun with the Balfour Declaration's promise of a Jewish national home while protecting the rights of the non-Jewish population, ended in failure to reconcile these competing objectives. Instead of an orderly transition to two states living side by side, the British withdrawal was followed by a full-scale war that would redraw the map of the region and create a refugee crisis that remains unresolved to this day. The period of illegal Jewish immigration and insurgency against British rule demonstrated the determination of Holocaust survivors to reach Palestine and the Yishuv's commitment to establishing a Jewish state that could control its own immigration policy. It also revealed the limitations of British power in the post-war era and the growing influence of the United States in Middle Eastern affairs. Most significantly, it set the stage for the establishment of the State of Israel and the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict that would shape the region for decades to come. Civil War, the collapse of the mandate. The UN General Assembly's vote on November 29, 1947, to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states triggered dramatically different reactions in the two communities. In Jewish neighborhoods, people danced in the streets, celebrating what they saw as international recognition of their right to statehood after centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust. In Arab areas, the response was one of anger and dismay at what was perceived as an unjust imposition by foreign powers, giving away land they considered rightfully theirs. Violence erupted almost immediately. The first major incident occurred on November 30, 1947, just one day after the UN vote, when Arab militants attacked a Jewish bus near Lydda, killing 5 passengers. Jewish reprisals followed, and the cycle of violence quickly escalated into what became known as the 1947 to 1948 Civil War in Mandatory Palestine. Initially, the conflict consisted primarily of Arab attacks on Jewish transportation and isolated settlements, and Jewish counterattacks. However, from January 1948, operations became increasingly militarized with the intervention of several Arab Liberation Army regiments inside Palestine. These forces, composed of volunteers from various Arab countries and commanded by Fawzi al-Qawuchi, a former Ottoman army officer, consolidated their presence in Galilee and Samaria. Meanwhile, Abd al-Qadir al-Husayni, a charismatic Palestinian leader and cousin of the Grand Mufti, arrived from Egypt with several hundred men of the Army of the Holy War, Jaish al-Jihad al-Muqaddas. Having recruited a few thousand volunteers, he organized the blockade of the 100,000 Jewish residents of Jerusalem, cutting off supplies of food, water, and medicine to the Jewish neighborhoods of the city. The Yishuv, Jewish community, attempted to break the siege of Jerusalem using convoys of up to 100 armored vehicles, but largely failed. The narrow, winding road to Jerusalem passed through hostile territory, making the convoys vulnerable to ambush. By March 1948, almost all of the Haganah's armored vehicles had been destroyed. The blockade was in full operation, and hundreds of Haganah members who had tried to bring supplies into the city had been killed. The situation in Jerusalem became desperate, with food, water, and medical supplies running critically low. As the fighting intensified, up to 100,000 Arabs, primarily from the urban upper and middle classes in Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem, or from Jewish-dominated areas, evacuated abroad or to Arab centers eastward. This early phase of what would later be called the Palestinian Exodus or Nakba, catastrophe, was largely voluntary and consisted mainly of the wealthy and middle class who had the means to leave temporarily, expecting to return after an Arab victory. The deteriorating situation caused the United States to withdraw its support for the partition plan, encouraging the Arab League to believe that the Palestinian Arabs, reinforced by the Arab Liberation Army, could defeat the Zionists and put an end to the plan for partition. The British, on the other hand, decided on February 7, 1948, to support the annexation of the Arab part of Palestine by Transjordan, whose army was commanded by British officers led by John Bagot Glubb, known as Glubb Pasha. Facing these challenges, David Ben-Gurion, the chairman of the Jewish Agency Executive, took decisive action. He reorganized the Haganah, the main Jewish defense force, and made conscription obligatory. Every Jewish man and woman in the country had to receive military training. The Haganah was transformed from a militia into a more conventional army, with clear chains of command and specialized units. Funding for arms purchases became critical. Golda Meir, later to become Israel's prime minister, traveled to the United States and raised millions of dollars from American Jewish communities, funds that were essential for purchasing weapons. In a surprising development, Stalin's Soviet Union decided to support the Zionist cause, seeing an opportunity to diminish British influence in the Middle East and possibly gain a foothold through the socialist elements in the Zionist movement. This Soviet support enabled Jewish representatives to purchase important arms in Czechoslovakia and other Eastern European countries, circumventing a Western arms embargo. Ben-Gurion gave Yigael Yadin, the Haganah's operations chief, the responsibility to plan for the announced intervention of the Arab states once the British withdrew. The result of his analysis was Plan Dalet, Plan D, which marked a significant shift as the Haganah passed from the defensive to the offensive. The plan sought to establish Jewish territorial continuity by securing the areas allocated to the Jewish state under the UN partition plan, as well as Jewish settlements outside those areas and corridors linking them. The implementation of Plan Dalet coincided with a series of military successes for the Jewish forces. In April and early May 1948, Tiberias, Haifa, Safed, Beisan, Beit Shean, Jaffa, and Acre fell to Haganah forces, resulting in the flight of more than 250,000 Palestinian Arabs. The circumstances of this exodus remain one of the most contested issues in the conflict, with Israeli historians traditionally arguing that Arab residents fled voluntarily or at the urging of Arab leaders, while Palestinian narratives and revisionist Israeli historians emphasize instances of expulsion and the role of fear created by atrocities such as the Deir Yassin massacre, where Irgun and Lehi forces killed over 100 villagers. One of the most significant battles during this period was Operation Nachshon, launched in early April 1948 with the objective of breaking the siege of Jerusalem. The operation, involving 1,500 Haganah fighters, succeeded in temporarily opening the road to Jerusalem and allowing some supplies to reach the city. During this operation, on April 9, 1948, Irgun and Lehi forces attacked the Arab village of Deir Yassin on the outskirts of Jerusalem. The resulting massacre, in which over 100 villagers were killed, including women and children, became a pivotal event in the conflict, spreading fear among Palestinian communities and contributing to the exodus. The Arab forces also experienced some successes during this period. On April 13, 1948, a convoy of 78 Jewish doctors, nurses, and medical students traveling to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus was ambushed, resulting in the deaths of 78 Jews, including many of Palestine's most prominent medical professionals. On May 13th, the Arab Legion and local forces captured the Etzion block of Jewish settlements south of Jerusalem after a lengthy siege, killing many of the defenders after they had surrendered. As the British mandate neared its end, both sides prepared for the next phase of the conflict. The Arab states surrounding Palestine made it clear that they would intervene militarily once the British withdrew. The Arab League had established a unified command for the invasion force, though in practice coordination between the various Arab armies would prove limited. On May 14, 1948, as the last British forces departed from Haifa, the Jewish People's Council gathered at the Tel Aviv Museum. There, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. The declaration carefully avoided specifying borders, but it promised equal social and political rights to all inhabitants irrespective of religion, race, or sex, freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture, and protection of the holy places of all religions. The new state was recognized almost immediately by the United States and the Soviet Union, though the U.S. recognition was de facto rather than de jure. Within hours of the declaration, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded the newly declared state, beginning the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, or Israel's War of Independence. The civil war phase of the conflict had demonstrated several important realities that would influence the subsequent conventional war. The Jewish forces had shown superior organization, training, and increasingly equipment. They had also demonstrated a unity of purpose that contrasted with divisions among Palestinian Arabs and between the various Arab states. The Palestinian exodus had already begun, creating a refugee problem that would become one of the most intractable aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The period between the UN partition vote and Israeli independence also revealed the limitations of international peacekeeping in the face of determined local actors. The United Nations had approved a partition plan, but had no effective means to implement it or prevent the violence that followed. The British, eager to end their costly and thankless mandate, focused primarily on an orderly withdrawal of their forces rather than ensuring a peaceful transition. The Civil War set the stage for the conventional war that followed, establishing patterns of territorial control that would influence the armistice lines eventually drawn in 1949. More fundamentally, it began the transformation of the conflict from a struggle between local communities under British rule to an international conflict between sovereign states that continues in various forms to this day. The Birth of a Nation and the First Arab-Israeli War, 1948 to 1949. The declaration of Israel's independence on May 14, 1948, marked the culmination of decades of Zionist efforts to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. As the British mandate officially ended, David Ben-Gurion, standing beneath a portrait of Theodor Herzl in the Tel Aviv Museum, proclaimed the establishment of the Jewish state. Within minutes of this declaration, the United States under President Harry S. Truman extended de facto recognition to the new state. Surprisingly, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin also quickly recognized Israel, though for different strategic reasons, primarily to diminish British influence in the Middle East and potentially gain a foothold through the socialist elements in the Zionist movement. The Arab response was immediate and hostile. The Arab League members, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, rejected the UN partition plan that had paved the way for Israel's creation. They asserted the right of self-determination for Arabs across the whole of Palestine and launched a coordinated military invasion. The first phase of the war saw initial Arab advances, with Egyptian forces moving up the coastal plain toward Tel Aviv, Jordanian and Iraqi forces attacking from the east, and Syrian forces entering from the northeast. The newly formed Israel Defense Forces, IDF, created from the pre-state Haganah militia, initially struggled against the better-equipped Arab armies. However, on May 29, 1948, the British initiated United Nations Security Council Resolution 50, declaring an arms embargo on the region. This resolution was violated by Czechoslovakia, with Soviet approval, which supplied Israel with critical military hardware, including fighter aircraft and heavy weapons. This Czech arms deal proved crucial in shifting the military balance. A UN-brokered truce came into effect on June 11, lasting for 4 weeks. This ceasefire period proved invaluable for Israel, allowing it to reorganize its forces and absorb new immigrants, many of whom were World War II veterans and Holocaust survivors who immediately joined the fighting forces. The truce also exposed divisions among the Arab states, whose forces lacked unified command and had competing political agendas. During this period, Ben-Gurion took decisive steps to consolidate the IDF's authority. The Palmach, the Haganah's elite strike force, Etzel, Irgun, and Lehi were required to cease independent operations and integrate into the unified IDF. This consolidation was not without internal conflict. During the ceasefire, Etzel attempted to bring in a private arms shipment aboard a ship called Altalena. When they refused to hand the weapons over to the government, Ben-Gurion ordered that the ship be sunk. Several Etzel members were killed in the ensuing confrontation, a traumatic event that nonetheless established the principle of a single military under government control. When fighting resumed in July, the tide had turned in Israel's favor. The IDF launched successful offensives in the Galilee, the Central Region, and the Negev Desert. By the end of the war, Israel had not only secured most of the territory allocated to it under the UN partition plan, but it also captured approximately 60% of the area designated for an Arab state. At the end of November, local ceasefires were arranged between Israel and its neighbors. On December 1, 1948, King Abdullah of Transjordan announced the annexation of the West Bank, a move recognized only by Britain and Pakistan. The 1949 armistice agreements formalized the end of the conflict. Israel signed separate agreements with Egypt, February 24, Lebanon, March 23, Jordan, April 3, and Syria, July 20. These agreements established armistice lines, later known as the Green Line, but explicitly stated that these were not to be considered permanent international boundaries. The armistice left Israel in control of the Galilee, Jezreel Valley, West Jerusalem, the coastal plain, and the Negev. The Syrians retained a strip of territory along the Sea of Galilee, originally allocated to the Jewish state. The Lebanese occupied a small area at Rosh Hanakra, and Egypt kept control of the Gaza Strip. Jordanian forces remained in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, areas that Jordan subsequently annexed. Following the ceasefire, Britain released over 2,000 Jewish detainees it had been holding in Cyprus and formally recognized the State of Israel. On May 11, 1949, Israel was admitted as a member of the United Nations, further cementing its international legitimacy. The human cost of the war was substantial. Out of an Israeli population of 650,000, approximately 6,000 people were killed, including 4,000 soldiers, about 1% of the Jewish population. According to United Nations figures, approximately 726,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled during the fighting, creating a refugee crisis that remains unresolved to this day. This mass exodus, known to Palestinians as the Nakba catastrophe, fundamentally altered the demographic landscape of the region and created a diaspora that would become a central issue in the ongoing conflict. Building a nation, the Ben-Gurion era, 1948 to 1963, the formative years, 1948 to 1955. With the fighting largely over, Israel turned to the task of building a functioning state. A 120-seat parliament, the Knesset, was established, initially meeting in Tel Aviv before moving to Jerusalem after the 1949 ceasefire. In January 1949, Israel held its first democratic elections. The Socialist Zionist parties Mapai and Mapam won the most seats, 46 and 19 respectively, reflecting the dominant left-wing labor Zionist ideology of the early state. David Ben-Gurion, leader of Mapai, became Israel's first prime minister. In forming his coalition government, Ben-Gurion made the significant decision to exclude Mapam, which maintained Stalinist positions and loyalty to the USSR. This choice signaled that despite receiving crucial military aid from the Soviet bloc during the war, Israel would not align itself with the communist world in the emerging Cold War. The Knesset elected Chaim Weizmann, a respected Zionist leader and scientist, as the first president of Israel, a largely ceremonial position. Hebrew and Arabic were established as the official languages of the new state. The early years of statehood were marked by massive immigration that transformed Israeli society. Between 1948 and 1951, the Jewish population doubled, with approximately 700,000 new immigrants arriving. This influx came from two main sources: Holocaust survivors from Europe and Jewish refugees from Arab and Muslim countries. About 300,000 arrived from Asian and North African nations as part of what became known as the Jewish exodus from Arab and Muslim countries, with the largest group, over 100,000, coming from Iraq. The European immigrants included more than 270,000 from Eastern Europe, primarily Romania and Poland. In 1950, the Knesset passed the Law of Return, a foundational piece of legislation that granted all Jews, those of Jewish ancestry, having at least one Jewish grandparent, and their spouses the right to immigrate to Israel and receive citizenship. This law formalized Israel's role as a haven for Jews worldwide and remains a cornerstone of Israeli national identity. The same year saw Operation Magic Carpet, a covert airlift that brought nearly the entire Jewish population of Yemen, about 50,000 people, to Israel. In 1951, Operation Ezra and Nehemiah transported 120,000 Iraqi Jews, over 90% of that country's Jewish population, to Israel after the Iraqi government temporarily permitted their emigration. By the late 1960s, about 500,000 Jews had left Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, with most settling in Israel. Over 2 decades, approximately 850,000 Jews from Arab countries relocated, primarily to Israel, 680,000, but also to France and the Americas. This mass exodus effectively ended Jewish life in communities that had existed for millennia across the Middle East and North Africa. The rapid population growth created enormous challenges for the young state. Between 1948 and 1958, Israel's population grew from 800,000 to 2 million. During this period, basic necessities like food, clothing, and furniture had to be rationed in what became known as the austerity period, Tekufat Hatsena. Many immigrants arriving as refugees with few possessions were housed in temporary transit camps known as ma'abarot. By 1952, over 200,000 immigrants were living in tents or prefabricated shacks built by the government. Financial pressures led Ben-Gurion to make the controversial decision to negotiate a reparations agreement with West Germany in 1952. The agreement, which provided Israel with several billion German marks in compensation for Nazi crimes, sparked fierce opposition. During the Knesset debate, approximately 5,000 demonstrators gathered outside, and riot police had to protect the building. Despite the opposition, the agreement was approved, providing crucial funds for development while establishing diplomatic relations with West Germany. Education was a priority for the new state. In 1949, education was made free and compulsory for all citizens until the age of 14. The state funded multiple educational systems: the mainstream secular system, religious Zionist schools, and a separate system created by the ultra-Orthodox Agudat Israel Party. A separate educational framework was established for the Arab population that remained within Israel's borders after the war. This fragmented approach to education reflected the diverse ideological currents within Israeli society, but also reinforced social divisions. Tensions emerged between the European origin, Ashkenazi leadership, and the growing population of Jews from Middle Eastern and North African countries, Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews. The government's attempts to impose a unified secular socialist culture led to conflicts, particularly with more traditional Mizrahi communities. One notorious example was the Yemenite children affair, in which there were attempts to secularize Yemenite children, including instances where their traditional side curls were cut by teachers. This controversy led to Israel's first public inquiry, the Fromkin Inquiry, the collapse of Ben-Gurion's coalition, and new elections in 1951. In its early years, Israel attempted to maintain a non-aligned position in the Cold War. However, this stance became untenable by 1952 when an anti-Semitic show trial was staged in Moscow, the Doctor's Plot, in which Jewish doctors were falsely accused of plotting to poison Stalin. Similar anti-Semitic trials occurred in other Soviet bloc countries, notably the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia. These events, combined with Israel's exclusion from the 1955 Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned States, effectively ended Israel's pursuit of neutrality. Regional tensions remained high. On May 19, 1950, Egypt announced the closure of the Suez Canal to Israeli ships and commerce, a blockade that violated international law. In 1952, a military coup in Egypt brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power, introducing a more assertive Arab nationalism to the region. As the United States pursued closer relations with Arab states, particularly Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Israel sought diplomatic alternatives, establishing good relations with newly independent states in Africa and with France, which was engaged in its own conflict with Arab nationalism in Algeria. The January 1955 elections saw Mapai win 40 seats and the Labour Party 10, with Moshe Sharett becoming prime minister at the head of a left-wing coalition. Between 1953 and 1956, intermittent clashes occurred along all of Israel's borders. Palestinian Fedayeen, guerrilla attacks, often organized and sponsored by Egypt, were launched from Egyptian-controlled Gaza. These attacks led to Israeli reprisal raids, creating a cycle of violence. Meanwhile, Egypt began developing its military capabilities, including recruiting former Nazi rocket scientists for a missile program in 1955. Sharett's government collapsed due to the Lavon affair, a failed covert operation in which Israeli agents attempted to plant bombs at American facilities in Egypt to disrupt U.S.-Egyptian relations. The operation was exposed when 11 agents were arrested. Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon was blamed, despite denying responsibility. The scandal led to Sharett's resignation and Ben-Gurion's return as prime minister. The Suez Crisis and its aftermath, 1955 to 1963. In 1955, Egypt concluded a massive arms deal with Czechoslovakia, acquiring Soviet weapons that threatened to shift the regional balance of power. The following year, President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, previously owned by British and French interests, and blockaded the Gulf of Aqaba, cutting off Israeli access to the Red Sea. These actions set the stage for the 1956 Suez Crisis. Israel made a secret agreement with France at Sèvres to coordinate military operations against Egypt. Britain and France, concerned about their access to the canal, joined the conspiracy. According to the plan, Israel would attack Egypt, after which Britain and France would call for both sides to withdraw from the canal area. When Egypt predictably refused, Anglo-French forces would intervene to protect the canal. It has been alleged that as part of this agreement, France also committed to helping Israel develop nuclear capabilities, leading to the construction of the Dimona nuclear facility. On October 29, 1956, Israeli forces under General Moshe Dayan launched Operation Kadesh, quickly advancing across the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France issued their pre-arranged ultimatum the next day, and when Egypt refused to comply, they began airstrikes on October 31st. By November 5th, Israeli forces had overrun the Sinai, and the Anglo-French invasion began. However, the operation faced unexpected international opposition. Both the United States under President Eisenhower and the Soviet Union strongly condemned the action, creating a rare moment of superpower agreement during the Cold War. Under intense diplomatic pressure, all three invading powers reluctantly accepted a ceasefire on November 7th. The United Nations established its first peacekeeping operation, the UN Emergency Force, UNEF, consisting of 6,000 troops from 10 nations to supervise the ceasefire. UN forces created a buffer zone across the Sinai between Israeli and Egyptian forces. Israel eventually withdrew from the Sinai after receiving U.S. guarantees regarding access to the Gulf of Aqaba and commitments that Egypt would prevent Palestinian raids from Gaza. In practice, however, the Suez Canal remained closed to Israeli shipping. The Suez Crisis marked a significant turning point in Middle Eastern geopolitics, signaling the decline of British and French influence in the region. Despite military defeat, Nasser emerged politically strengthened, having successfully stood up to European colonial powers. For Israel, the operation achieved some short-term security objectives but reinforced its diplomatic isolation. Domestically, Israeli politics continued to evolve. In 1956, two modern Orthodox religious Zionist parties, Mizrachi and Hapoel HaMizrachi, merged to form the National Religious Party, NRP. This party would become a fixture in Israeli coalition governments until 1992, typically controlling the Ministry of Education. In the 1959 elections, Mapai increased its representation to 47 seats, with Ben-Gurion remaining prime minister. A significant moment in Israel's reckoning with the Holocaust came in 1960 when Mossad agents located Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief administrators of the Nazi genocide, living in Argentina. In a daring operation, they kidnapped him and brought him to Israel for trial. The 1961 trial, broadcast internationally, featured testimony from numerous Holocaust survivors and brought the full horror of the Nazi genocide into public consciousness in unprecedented ways. Eichmann was found guilty and executed in 1962, the only person ever sentenced to death by an Israeli court. The trial is widely considered a turning point in public awareness of the Holocaust, both in Israel and internationally. Ben-Gurion's second premiership ended amid renewed controversy over the Lavon affair. In 1961, the opposition Herut Party, led by Menachem Begin, introduced a no-confidence motion related to the scandal. Ben-Gurion demanded that Lavon be removed as head of the Histadrut, Israel's labor federation, as a condition for remaining in office. Though his demands were met and Mapai won the subsequent election with 42 seats, the affair continued to haunt Israeli politics. In 1962, another controversy erupted when the Mossad began assassinating German scientists working on Egypt's missile program after intelligence suggested the weapons might be designed to carry chemical warheads. The operation, codenamed Damocles, was condemned by Ben-Gurion and led to the resignation of Mossad director Isser Harel. The following year, Ben-Gurion resigned again over the Lavon affair after failing to secure his party's full support. Levi Eshkol succeeded him as leader of Mapai and became Israel's third prime minister. From the Six-Day War to the Yom Kippur War, 1963 to 1974, the Eshkol years and the Six-Day War, 1963 to 1969. Levi Eshkol's premiership began during a period of relative calm, but would culminate in one of the most consequential conflicts in Israeli history. In 1964, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria developed a unified military command, signaling growing Arab coordination against Israel. Meanwhile, Israel completed work on its national water carrier, a massive engineering project designed to transfer water from the Sea of Galilee to the arid Negev desert. Arab states responded by attempting to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River, increasing tensions with Syria. Israeli politics underwent significant realignment during this period. Ben-Gurion broke away from Mapai to form a new party called Rafi, joined by future leaders Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan. On the right, Begin's Herut party merged with the liberals to form Gahal. Despite these challenges, the Mapai Labor Alliance won the 1965 elections with 45 seats, allowing Eshkol to continue as prime minister. Until 1966, France had been Israel's principal arms supplier. However, following France's withdrawal from Algeria, President Charles de Gaulle announced that France would cease supplying Israel with weapons, and even refused to refund money paid for 50 warplanes that were never delivered. This shift forced Israel to seek new security partnerships. In February 1966, the United States stepped in, announcing it would take over the former French and West German commitments to maintain military stabilization in the Middle East. The American package included over 200 M48 tanks and that year, A-4 Skyhawk tactical aircraft. Domestically, the Eshkol government eased security restrictions on Arab citizens of Israel and made efforts to better integrate them into Israeli society. The period also saw cultural developments, including the introduction of black and white television broadcasts in 1966 and the debut of Naomi Shemer's iconic song, Jerusalem of Gold, in May 1967, which would become an unofficial anthem during the war that followed. The road to the Six-Day War began in May 1967 when Syria, Egypt, and Jordan amassed troops along Israel's borders. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping and demanded that the UN emergency force leave the Sinai, threatening escalation to full-scale war. Egyptian radio broadcasts contained inflammatory rhetoric, including references to a coming genocide. On May 26, Nasser declared, "The battle will be a general one, and our basic objective will be to destroy Israel." Israel considered the closure of the Straits of Tiran a casus belli, justification for war. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq signed defense pacts, and Iraqi troops began deploying to neighboring Arab states. Algeria also announced it would send troops to Egypt. Facing what it perceived as an existential threat, Israel launched a preemptive strike on the morning of June 5, 1967. The Israeli Air Force's Operation Focus destroyed most of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in the opening hours of the conflict. Later the same day, Israel struck the air forces of Jordan and Syria. With air superiority established, Israeli ground forces advanced rapidly on three fronts. By June 11th, just 6 days after the war began, Arab forces were routed, and all parties accepted the ceasefire called for by UN Security Council Resolutions 235 and 236. The results of the war transformed the Middle East. Israel gained control of the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. East Jerusalem was formally annexed by Israel, while the other territories came under military occupation. The territorial gains more than tripled the area under Israeli control and brought 1 million Palestinians under Israeli rule. The Arab response to defeat came at the August 1967 Arab League summit in Khartoum, Sudan, which produced the famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. According to Egyptian historian Abd al-Azim Ramadan, this hardline stance left only one option: continued conflict with Israel. The aftermath of the war saw the beginning of Jewish settlement in the newly occupied territories. In 1968, Rabbi Moshe Levinger led a group of religious Zionists who established the first Jewish settlement near Hebron, called Kiryat Arba. This marked the beginning of what would become an extensive settlement movement, though religious settlements remained limited until after 1974. Domestically, the Eshkol government extended compulsory education until the age of 16 for all citizens, previously 14, and launched an extensive program of educational integration. In major cities, Children from predominantly Sephardi Mizrahi neighborhoods were bused to newly established middle schools in more affluent areas, a policy that remained in place until after 2000. Despite Israel's decisive military victory, security challenges persisted. In March 1968, Israeli forces attacked the Palestinian militia Fatah at its base in the Jordanian town of Karame. Though the Israelis destroyed the camp, they suffered unexpectedly high casualties, and the operation was not considered a success. The Palestinians claimed victory, boosting the prestige of Fatah and the PLO throughout the Arab world. By early 1969, fighting broke out between Egypt and Israel along the Suez Canal, developing into the 1969 to 1970 War of Attrition, in which Israeli planes struck deep into Egypt in retaliation for Egyptian shelling of Israeli positions. Golda Meir and the Yom Kippur War, 1969 to 1974. In early 1969, Levi Eshkol died in office of a heart attack. He was succeeded by Golda Meir, who became Israel's fourth prime minister and the first woman to lead the country. In the subsequent election, Meir's party won 56 of the 120 Knesset seats, the largest percentage ever won by an Israeli party. Gahal retained its 26 seats, remaining the second largest party. Regional dynamics shifted dramatically in September 1970 during what became known as Black September in Jordan. King Hussein of Jordan, threatened by the growing power of Palestinian militant organizations within his kingdom, launched a military campaign that drove the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, out of the country. When Syrian tanks invaded Jordan to aid the PLO, Israel, at the request of the United States, moved troops to the border and threatened Syria, causing the Syrians to withdraw. The center of PLO activity subsequently shifted to Lebanon, where the 1969 Cairo Agreement had granted Palestinians autonomy within the south of the country. The area controlled by the PLO became known as Fatahland and contributed to the Lebanese civil war that would erupt in 1975. The crisis also led to Hafez al-Assad taking power in Syria. Egyptian President Nasser died of a heart attack during this period and was succeeded by Anwar Sadat. The early 1970s saw increased Soviet anti-Semitism, which, combined with enthusiasm generated by Israel's 1967 victory, led many Soviet Jews to apply for emigration to Israel. Most were refused exit visas and faced persecution by Soviet authorities. Some were arrested and became known as prisoners of Zion, a cause célèbre for human rights activists worldwide. Domestic tensions also surfaced during this period. In 1971, a group calling themselves the Israeli Black Panthers, inspired by the American movement of the same name, held violent demonstrations to protest discrimination against Mizrahi Jews and persistent social gaps between European origin and Middle Eastern origin Jewish communities. These protests forced the Israeli public to confront ongoing inequalities within Jewish society. Israel faced a devastating terrorist attack during the 1972 Munich Olympics, when members of the Palestinian group Black September killed 2 Israeli athletes and took 9 others hostage. A botched German rescue attempt led to the death of all the hostages along with 5 of the 8 terrorists. The 3 surviving Palestinians were later released by West German authorities in exchange for hostages from a hijacked Lufthansa flight. The Israeli government responded with Operation Wrath of God, a years-long campaign of assassinations targeting those responsible for the massacre. In 1972, the new Egyptian president Anwar Sadat expelled Soviet advisors from Egypt, signaling a potential shift in regional alignments. However, this development, along with frequent invasion exercises by Egypt and Syria, led to Israeli complacency about the threat these countries posed. Additionally, the desire not to be held responsible for initiating conflict and an election campaign highlighting security contributed to Israel's failure to mobilize adequately, despite receiving intelligence warnings of an impending attack. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and overran Israeli positions in the Sinai, while Syrian forces pushed into the Golan Heights. The initial Arab successes shocked Israel and the world, shattering the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the IDF since 1967. both superpowers rushed arms to their allies. The Soviet Union resupplied Egypt and Syria, while the United States, under Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's direction, airlifted critical military supplies to Israel in Operation Nickel Grass. After the initial setbacks, Israel managed to stabilize the fronts and counterattack. The Syrians were repulsed at the Valley of Tears on the Golan Heights. On the southern front, while the Egyptians captured a strip of territory in Sinai, they were eventually outflanked by Israeli forces that crossed the Suez Canal and encircled the Egyptian Third Army. U.S. diplomatic efforts led to disengagement agreements with Egypt, January 18, 1974, and Syria, May 31, 1974. The war had profound consequences beyond the battlefield. It triggered the 1973 oil crisis when Saudi Arabia led an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel. The resulting severe shortages caused massive increases in global oil prices and led many countries to break off or downgrade relations with Israel. Israel was also banned from participation in the Asian Games and other Asian sporting events. The war's outcome reshaped Israeli politics. Prior to the December 1973 elections, Gahal and several right-wing parties united to form the Likud bloc, led by Menachem Begin. Though Labor won the election with 51 seats, and Golda Meir remained prime minister, the Likud's strong showing, 39 seats, signaled growing conservative strength. Public anger over Israel's lack of preparedness for the war led to the appointment of the Agronaut Commission to investigate. The commission exonerated the government but held the IDF chief of staff and head of military intelligence responsible. Despite this finding, public dissatisfaction with the government's handling of the war remained high. Following a deadly Palestinian terrorist attack on a school in Ma'alot in May 1974, where 22 children were killed, and the PLO gaining observer status at the UN in November 1974, Golda Meir resigned as prime minister. From Labor to Likud, the shifting political landscape, 1974 to 1992. Rabin's first term and Begin's rise, 1974 to 1983. Following Meir's resignation, Yitzhak Rabin, a former IDF chief of staff and ambassador to the United States, became Israel's fifth prime minister. His term coincided with the growth of the settlement movement in the occupied territories. Religious Zionist followers of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook formed the Gush Eminim, Bloc of the Faithful movement, and began an organized campaign to establish Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, viewing this as the fulfillment of biblical promises and a way to secure these territories permanently for Israel. Israel faced increasing international isolation during this period. In November 1975, the United Nations General Assembly, under the guidance of Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim, later revealed to have concealed his own Nazi past, adopted Resolution 3379, which declared Zionism to be a form of racism and racial discrimination. This resolution, viewed by Israel and many Western countries as an outrageous slander, would remain in place until December 1991, when it was rescinded by Resolution 4686. Domestic tensions also surfaced. In March 1976, a massive strike by Arab citizens of Israel protested a government plan to expropriate land in the Galilee. The demonstrations, which became known as Land Day, resulted in the deaths of 6 protesters and marked a new phase of political activism among Israel's Arab minority. In July 1976, Rabin ordered one of Israel's most daring military operations, Operation Entebbe. After an Air France flight was hijacked by Palestinian and German terrorists and flown to Uganda, Israeli special forces mounted a rescue mission over 2,500 miles from Israel. The operation successfully freed most of the hostages, though the mission commander, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, brother of future Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was killed. Rabin's term ended prematurely in April 1977, when it emerged that his wife maintained a dollar account in the United States, which violated Israeli currency regulations at the time. This relatively minor infraction, which became known as the dollar account affair, forced his resignation. Shimon Peres took over as acting prime minister and led the labor alignment into the subsequent elections. The May 1977 elections produced a political earthquake in Israel. For the first time since independence, the right-wing Likud bloc, led by Menachem Begin, won the largest number of seats, 43, and formed a government. This historic shift, often called the Mahapach, upheaval, ended nearly 3 decades of labor dominance and reflected changing demographics, with Mizrahi Jews, who often felt marginalized by the labor establishment, increasingly supporting Likud. Begin's premiership saw dramatic developments in Israel's relations with its neighbors. In November 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made a historic visit to Jerusalem, addressing the Knesset at Begin's invitation. This unprecedented move by an Arab leader recognized Israel's right to exist and established the basis for direct negotiations. Following Sadat's visit, a group of 350 Yom Kippur War veterans formed the Peace Now movement to encourage Israeli governments to pursue peace with Arab states. The peace process faced violent opposition. In March 1978, 11 armed Lebanese Palestinians carried out the Coastal Road massacre in Israel, killing 38 civilians, including 13 children. 3 days later, Israeli forces crossed into Lebanon in Operation Litani, aimed at pushing PLO forces away from the border. After the UN Security Council passed Resolution 425 calling for Israeli withdrawal and the creation of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, Israel withdrew its troops. The peace initiative gained momentum in September 1978 when U.S. President Jimmy Carter invited Sadat and Begin to meet at Camp David. After intensive negotiations, they agreed on a framework for peace between Israel and Egypt and outlined principles for a comprehensive Middle East peace. The Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty was signed on March 26, 1979, ending 30 years of war between the two countries. Under the treaty, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in April 1982. The Arab League reacted by suspending Egypt from the organization and moving its headquarters from Cairo to Tunis. Sadat paid the ultimate price for peace when he was assassinated in 1981 by Islamic fundamentalists opposed to the treaty. The peace agreement with Egypt brought significant benefits to both countries. They became the two largest recipients of U.S. military and financial aid, a status they maintained until the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 21st century. For Israel, the treaty removed its most powerful Arab adversary from the conflict, allowing it to focus resources elsewhere. Israel continued to develop its military capabilities during this period. In December 1978, the Israeli-designed Merkava battle tank entered service with the IDF, reducing dependence on foreign arms suppliers. Israel's technological sector also began to flourish, with a diverse set of high-tech industries developing by the early 1980s.